Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and for many of you, good evening. Welcome to the International Water and Climate Mitigation Symposium, co-hosted by the U.S. Water Alliance and Xylem. My name is Katie Lackey, and I'm a Senior Program Manager at the U.S. Water Alliance. As folks are signing in, I'd like to give a few logistics reminders for the day. All participants have been automatically muted upon entry. Please double check this on your end to help ensure that everyone can hear speakers throughout the symposium. We are recording today's symposium and plan to make it available following the event. And of course, since this is a symposium, we are here to learn, to share ideas, and to motivate climate action in the water sector. So we invite you to engage throughout the day. Feel free to turn on your videos if you're comfortable. Take a moment to introduce yourselves and where you're calling in from in the chat. Share your insights and, most importantly, questions for the speakers in the chat as well. We also encourage you to join the conversation today and beyond on social media by following #NetZeroWater on Twitter and LinkedIn. And finally, if you have any questions or tech issues, please send a private chat to myself or the tech assistant in your Zoom screen. Next slide, please. For those new to the U.S. Water Alliance, we are a national nonprofit organization and network of utilities, water-reliant businesses, consulting firms, community and environmental organizations, and more, all dedicated to advancing a sustainable water future for all. Our work is focused on 3 areas: educating the nation on the true value of water and the need for investment in its infrastructure, accelerating the adoption of holistic, integrated One Water management strategies through a program of national dialogues, papers, and policy development. And finally, we celebrate what works, helping to drive innovation in the water sector by highlighting One Water champions and early successes. Next slide, please. For today's symposium, over the next 4 hours, we'll discover why water needs to step up on climate mitigation, what our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is as a sector, and learn from other countries on how sectors and utilities around the globe are taking action to reduce emissions and pursue net zero water. We will journey through an exciting series of presentations, panels, and briefings to learn about international research underway, key water dialogues this past year that are advancing climate action, and finally, we'll dive into the art of the possible with stories from 3 countries already advancing a climate secure future through water. 4 hours is a lot on Zoom, especially when we're all in other meetings as well. So please be comfortable and do what you need to take care of yourself. We've also built in 2 breaks to help with this throughout the symposium. And as we head into this agenda, I'd like to give a big shout out and thank you to our core partners in this effort, particularly Al Cho at Xylem, Cindy Wallace-Lage at Black & Veatch, Art Umbel from Stantec, Michael McAfee from PolicyLink, and Jalon White-Newsome from Empowering a Green Environment and Economy, LLC. I'd also like to thank our many stellar Alliance staff behind the scenes: Sarah Amanzada, Emily Simonson, Linda Lee, Yasmin Snally-Norman, and Anda Yates. Much of what you see here today is because of their good work in the background. So thank you all. Next slide, please. And finally, I have one more shout out as we get started to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for their generous financial support and partnership on the Recovering Stronger initiative, which includes today's symposium. Thank you for being here today and supporting this work. A year and a half into COVID, we're all well aware that this pandemic has upended lives, disrupted business as usual, challenged the way we relate to one another and the planet, and exposed or reinforced the structural inequities we see in water and throughout our societies, whether you're here in the United States or calling in from somewhere else. At the U.S. Water Alliance, however, we believe that times of upheaval can lead to moments of radical change. And for the water sector, we see this pandemic as a unique opportunity to turn this moment of deep disruption into lasting change in how we view, value, and manage our nation's water systems. Next slide, please. So through our 2-year initiative, Recovering Stronger is designed to mobilize a diverse network of partners around the United States to drive local, state, and federal policies and programs to make the water sector more resilient, sustainable, and equitable. Specifically, we need to drive towards 5 interlocking solutions, which you see here up on the screen. Addressing one of these without the others wouldn't lead to significant transformation. But together, the water sector and the country will be fundamentally better off and more prepared for future challenges if we can address these 5 solutions. And it's that 5th solution down at the bottom that we're really here to dive into today. We in water have been adapting to climate impacts for decades, but we can also be part of the solution moving forward. Next slide, please. To meet that 5th solution, the U.S. Water Alliance, together with core partners and supporters mentioned, launched the Imagination Challenge, water's role in the Race to Zero, earlier this summer. You're going to hear more about the official Race to Zero campaign from Kate Lamb today. But for now, let me say the Imagination Challenge is a call to the U.S. Water Alliance network and really the U.S. water sector. Our charge is to understand our role in climate mitigation and work together to create a shared vision and pathway for greenhouse gas reductions across the U.S. water sector. We're approaching this challenge through a series of facilitated and collaborative convenings, including water dialogues, a cross-sector roundtable in partnership with the Aspen Institute, and of course, today's International Symposium, which is where we begin, because we recognize that we have much to learn from the excellent work underway across the global water community. The symposium is actually 2 days. Today is open to the public, so thank you all for being here. And tomorrow will be a closed working session for the Imagination team, which I'll talk about in a moment. Along the way, we are also working closely and coordinating with several international partners on their own journeys to net zero water and the race to zero ahead of COP26. Next slide, please. So back to the Imagination team for a moment. Representatives from over 30 organizations in the United States have joined the team and are undertaking the Imagination Challenge over the next 6 months. We intentionally selected a diverse set of perspectives because we know that we are all in this together. As my colleague Cindy Wallace-Lage likes to say, when it comes to climate change, we either all win or we all lose. So up here on the screen, you'll see the team includes representatives from water associations, utilities, academia, and consulting firms, but also environmental organizations, equity leaders, rising OneWater professionals, and artists. These folks are here today, so say hi in the chat, share your best ideas with them, and connect with them as you see fit. In the chat, you'll also find a link to the full team, including names and organizations. And with that, I would like to turn it over to my colleague Al Cho from Xylem. Welcome, Al.
Hi, Katie. Thanks so much. My name's Al Cho. Greetings, everyone. I work at Xylem and I serve on the board of the U.S. Water Alliance. And I just want to welcome all of you on behalf of our whole OneWater organizing team. That includes Katie and the U.S. Water Alliance team, Cindy from Black & Veatch, Jalan from EGE Squared, Michael from PolicyLink, and Art from Stantec. And just thank all of you for joining this international symposium, which is going to launch the Imagination Challenge on climate mitigation for the water sector. Now, as Katie said, that's the last time you're going to hear me talk about any specific organizations, because this Imagination Challenge has to be about setting some new norms to tackle a global crisis, taking off our badges and our hats to come together as one sector and as one team. Because the challenge of climate change is a collective one that calls for a collective response from our sector and from every other. And that's the culture and the spirit of this Imagination Challenge. We're all joining together today at a major turning point for our sector. We've all heard that climate change is a clear and present danger, but our response as a water sector is still fragmented and forming. When the 6 of us got together and started asking which utilities have a net zero commitment all around the world, nobody had a list. I reached out to all of the associations. A number of people talked to their international colleagues, and there wasn't a single kind of place where people were keeping track of this. And that's just an indication of where we are in this process. And we're working to create that list and would welcome your help. As we start that process of forming around this theme, there's some questions we're all going to be hearing from the people around us as we take the next steps around climate mitigation. First, we hear mitigation is really important, but let's worry about adaptation since climate change will be experienced through water. We'll hear mitigation is important, but why should we in the water sector take action since energy and transportation are the real drivers of emissions? And we'll hear climate mitigation is important, but do we really need more requirements and standards when it's already hard to do the job that we have today? Our work together here is about turning those buts into ands. Yes, we have a lot going on as a sector, and it still makes sense for us to have this discussion about mitigation. The more we can do to mitigate climate change, the less we have to adapt. And from a One Water perspective, recent research that we'll hear more about today shows that water management accounts for about 10% of global emissions across the cycle. And the best part is that a number of water utilities and water users around the world have already shown that many of the actions required to get us to net zero are not only possible, they can also make our infrastructure more resilient and more equitable. And that's why we're starting this Imagination Challenge with an international symposium. Because as the saying goes, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. In the UK, in Denmark, large parts of Australia, and I'll note in some cities in the US, the water sector has already made significant progress and concrete commitments to net zero emissions in the water sector. And so today's program is all about baselining together on some of the great work that is already happening all around the world. Because that makes our job easier. It's not about embarking on a risky or unpredictable pathway to somewhere unknown. It's about demystifying the topic and picking and choosing from the range of examples and pathways that credible, well-run water and wastewater utilities around the world have already made. And then translating and imagining what would work best here in the United States, especially in the context of equitable One Water policy. And for that, I want to thank our international guests for sharing their experiences with us today. Finally, on that topic of baselining with common language, I want to call out that the teams created a Climate 101 document that has really been intended to create a glossary of terms that we can use to start to align on shared language and vocabulary. Feel free to visit that, refer to that, and add to it over the course of the discussion today. So lastly, this is going to be an interactive couple of days as much as possible in this virtual environment. And so I'm going to shut up now and ask our team to flash up a quick poll to start off our day before I hand it over to Michael McAfee for some calls to action. We just want to get a baseline of whether the organization that you represent has made a One Water net zero commitment. And so I'm going to ask if we can go ahead and flash up that poll. So let's take a couple of moments, if you wouldn't mind, just to input an answer to that question, and we'll see what everyone on this call is thinking about. Let's give people another maybe 10 or 15 seconds. And Katie, would you mind flashing your hands up when we're ready to unveil the results?
I think that is about everyone who's going to take it. Can you all see the results? Not yet.
Okay. We cannot.
I think if I click end polling here. All right, here we go. Can you all see them now? Yeah.
Yes, we can. And so that's just an interesting baseline that about half of the people represented on this call represent organizations that have not yet made a greenhouse gas reduction commitment of any kind, but about half have, and nearly 10% have made a net zero water commitment. And so we hope to learn a lot more about that over the course of the day. Katie, thank you so much for those introductory remarks. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Michael McAfee.
Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be with you, Katie. Thank you and the U.S. Water Alliance team for your leadership in putting this event together. And thank you all for joining us today. PolicyLink joined this challenge because we believe that radical imagination is needed if we're going to create a just and fair society. And no matter what issue we're working on to advance racial and economic inclusion, racial and economic equity, that climate impacts it. And so this is the critical issue when we think about just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And so while we're not a water organization per se, that is why we're here, because we all must join in transformative solidarity and work on these issues. So thank you for allowing me to join in this space today. I have learned from a lot of the things that you all have written. A warmer world, even by 0.5 degrees Celsius, has more evaporation, leading to more water in the atmosphere. And such changing conditions put our agriculture, health, water, and supply more at risk. And every rise in warming is worse for the planet than the last. And ultimately, what we're beginning to see around the world is that climate change ultimately affects all of us, and the most vulnerable populations especially, nationally and globally. Those folks are often hurt first and worst and continue to be left behind even in the recoveries. But what I'm glad about and why I'm honored to be here is that it's not too late to slow the pace of climate change as long as we begin to act today. We must be in solidarity with our partners like you on this call and working across all sectors, listening and centering those who are most impacted by the problems associated with climate change. Now, to this end, I have the exciting privilege to introduce Mami Hara. Mami is the General Manager of Seattle Public Utilities, and she is the incoming CEO of the U.S. Water Alliance. She is committed to advancing an equitable and sustainable Seattle region through collaboration, strategic investment, and partnering with community, and seeks to expand this ethic throughout Seattle Public Utilities. Mami brings over 3 decades of experience in sustainable land and water management practices and advances them through cultivating leaders, partnerships, participation, planning, science, data-informed decisions, and knowledge sharing. So it is an honor to introduce to you Mami Hara.
Thank you, Michael and the Alliance, for inviting me to this important conversation. The topic of the symposium is among the most existentially important and dramatic that we face. So please forgive me some pretty dramatic assertions. As water managers, we know that climate impacts are water impacts. Every hydrologic cycle in every place is changing, and rapidly, at times well beyond the capabilities of our infrastructure and existing supply. Water managers and communities everywhere face challenges responding to the pressing needs of climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and climate justice. But we're not simply the inheritors of climate impacts. Conventionally, water management requires considerable energy and the use of fossil fuels, which means that utilities can drive significant GHG emissions. From fires to floods, intense freezing to searing heat, drought to rising tides, algal blooms to dying forests, we water managers must contend with the many heads of the climate hydra and our role in their growth. At the same time that we're fighting fire and flood, we have to turn our eyes to preventing them. Our communities suffer in so many ways from the impacts of climate change. And those impacts increasingly exacerbate environmental and service challenges in lower income communities, where impacts such as excessive heat, flooding, and service outages exact inequitable tolls. In fact, The recent EPA Social Vulnerability Report clearly demonstrates the disproportionate impacts of climate change on socially vulnerable people across our country. I know that we, as water managers, as stewards of our community's health, want to do all we can to both alleviate and prevent this harm. We utilities find ourselves in local dialogues caught between proponents of adaptation and mitigation. Communities want us to invest in resiliency and adaptation, while many policymakers want us to solely focus on the crisis of mitigation to avoid conceding defeat. What is not recognized by many is that in our work, the distinction and conflict between adaptation and mitigation doesn't need to exist. In our work, prevention and healing can come together, and we can address both in an integrated way, working at different scales from watershed management to fleet and facility investments. For us, it is much more useful to frame our climate work as climate action rather than mitigation or adaptation, and to demonstrate the impact of integrated, holistic investment. But I know that individually, even within our own communities, we do not yet fully know the way. But some of us know some of the way. And working together, utilities can piece together the way and affect incredible climate action. While there are no clear rules or singular answers to the climate challenges we face, as a network of infrastructure managers and water managers, we share enormous collective opportunity to reduce GHG emissions throughout our work and by sharing priorities and actions. I don't know how we find the room to do this while climate change impacts challenge our ability to provide our services. Except I do know that we, working together as a national infrastructure network, that we can collectively find more opportunities to minimize risk and help everyone become invested in the very important outcomes of our systems. The federal government is taking early steps with potentially powerful investments and ambitious goals in infrastructure resilience. It is then up to us to make good on these initial investments, no matter the constraints placed upon them, and to demonstrate the wisdom of investing in integrated GHG mitigating, adaptive, and resilient design. Regardless of where the early funding goes, we all win if early projects succeed. It is up to us to collaborate and to realize the circularity, sustainability, and humane principles embedded in One Water and zero waste approaches, and to understand how they can uniquely and effectively play out in our respective communities. For example, Seattle Public Utilities is prioritizing climate as a key driver in our strategic business planning and investments. In recent years, we've been transitioning our solid waste fleet to all renewable fuel and installing charging stations at our facilities and reducing and electrifying our vehicle fleet and facilities. We've been strengthening operational preparedness and adaptive flexibility in our drinking water supply and our in-stream flow management. We're doing this by monitoring and evaluating the changes to snowpack and rainfall to incorporate into our supply and demand forecasting and operational approaches. We're incorporating climate data into our capital investment planning process because what used to be a 100-year storm is now a 25-year storm. In response to this documented shift, SPU has updated our climate scenarios and are using these climate perturbed models in capital investment decisions from mega projects to smaller ones. We're very importantly centering racial justice in efforts such as our Shape Our Water integrated system plan and planning for 50 years of equitable and environmentally sound drainage and wastewater investments. We're also fostering multi-benefit public-private partnerships, such as one that is between our utility, a private developer, and our state transportation department that creates an innovative large-scale green stormwater infrastructure project that captures currently 2 million gallons of stormwater from a state highway bridge. This project uses health-enhancing, carbon-mitigating swales and rain gardens to capture and clean polluted water that would otherwise have flowed into Lake Union, which is local critical salmon habitat. We're prioritizing community climate adaptation investments in vulnerable communities, such as planning for sea level rise adaptation and community resilience in the low-lying Duwamish Valley, and investing in urban forestry and identified urban heat islands. And really importantly, we're initiating a sustainable energy plan with the goal of becoming a carbon neutral utility by 2030. This work is just a beginning and only at one utility. We all have much to rapidly share and do together to realize the very necessary potential of our collective climate action. Again, thank you, Michael and the Alliance, for inviting me and Seattle Public Utilities in this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Mommy. Thank you, Michael, for those very important calls to action. It's important to highlight these both on the individual utility and organization scale, but also what we can do collectively. So thank you both for being here today. With this, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Art Umbel, who is going to introduce us to our speakers for the State of the Science section. Art, welcome.
Thank you, Katie, and welcome everyone to this, what I think is going to be a very interesting session. Following up on Mommy's words are going to be very important to understand. As Katie mentioned, this session is called the State of the Science. And as we gear up towards COP26 later this fall, the focus of that idea is around accelerating actions toward, the Paris agreements, and that the UN framework as well is being developed more appropriately. The real question, I think, that's being asked is, what will it really take to reach these net zero targets by our 2050 timeframe? I think it's very encouraging that already 70% of the countries around the globe have made some level of net zero target commitment. But the questions that remain that are being challenged with the COP26, for example, are questions around, is reducing emissions simply enough? Perhaps we should broaden that question into, what about the restoration and protection of our natural environment that has received and experienced a huge price of our lack of work towards climate change over the decades? So what is the science telling us at this point in time? How good are our models, for example? Currently, our models for land and sea and the atmosphere, they're not fully integrated. And as such, we can't yet see a more comprehensive picture and understanding of the interactions of emissions across these three domains of our natural environment. And perhaps that leads us then to a second question that's more in the policy arena. And that question is, how should science, in all its capacity to project and to predict amidst uncertainties in data, can we expect it to influence public policy in a way that it creates that motivational incentive for real action? I think this is the challenge that we see coming to us and will be addressed at COP26. And we want to talk a little bit more about that today. In doing this, I want to introduce two of our next speakers that will begin to address some of the ideas that they're involved with in their work. The first of which I'd like to introduce Josh Weinberg. He is the program manager at the Water Resources Department at the Stockholm International Water Institute, which he joined back in 2007. He holds a Master's of Science from the Resilience Center at Stockholm University in Natural Resource Management and Governance. And he has extensive experience working in China, in Europe, and globally on a broad range of issues within the water, climate, and environmental governance arenas. Along with Josh, I would like to introduce Noreen Anisha. She's an environmental researcher and doctoral candidate in environmental sciences at Oregon State University, and she specializes in freshwater systems that overlap within climate change. She's worked on projects in climate change mitigation and adaptation in the water sector in Bangladesh, and she's a research fellow for the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. Currently, her focus is on understanding the coupling of human and natural systems dynamics in nature-based solutions for climate mitigation. So with that, I would like to begin by introducing formally now Josh to take over and present his portion. Josh.
Okay, thank you very much, and hello, everybody. I'd like to thank Art and the organizers very much for the invitation to speak today, and also for your efforts to start this very important initiative on water and climate mitigation. As referenced a little bit, I've been working with a team from the Stockholm International Water Institute, the Potsdam Institute in Germany, the Stockholm Resilience Center, the United Nations Development Program, and the German aid organization GIZ, on a report that's looking both broadly and in some depth at the linkages between water and climate mitigation. So much of what will be presented here today, first I need to say that it must be credited to the very many contributing experts that are working on different chapters of the report. While this work is ongoing and the report's under production, I would like to share with you some initial insights and reflections that we have from our research. I'd also like to share a bit about on what the report will include and why we felt this was a topic that required deeper investigation. And next slide, please. Well, echoing what was said earlier by Mami, climate action may be a better word than discussing only climate mitigation and adaptation. But I think what we can see from looking back at what's been going on in the past 2 decades is the relationship between water and climate adaptation has now been pretty clearly communicated, and it's easy to understand. We see floods, we feel droughts, and unfortunately, these kinds of water challenges are there in front of our face, which feels like each day now. The fact that the water community had to work so hard to gain traction on something as obvious as these risks coming from floods and droughts is actually a bit striking. But progress is seen. Water is featured now in adaptation planning much more commonly worldwide. You can find this in NDC planning, for example, where water is now included in many committed actions towards climate adaptation, as well as national adaptation plans. But when you dig a bit deeper into the subject, as we've done with our report on climate mitigation and water, you realize that water is much more important to climate mitigation than is conceived by most and managed in practice. Next slide, please. There was a report published in 2020. It was an excellent report led by the German Development Cooperation aid organization, GIZ, which provided a really good overview of water and climate linkages, including climate impacts on water and its role in adaptation and mitigation. But of the, I don't know, maybe 15 chapters, there was 1 chapter on mitigation, but quite many on adaptation. But in that report, the authors made an estimate of that about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to water when you look only in 4 different areas: water and wastewater management, peatlands, rice cultivation, and the organic matter and nutrients in surface water. 10% is a significant number, but it's more important than that. This 10% only represents a small part of water's place in climate mitigation. And first, it's also a conservative estimate, even within those areas. I don't have time to unpack that statement, unfortunately. And it also, these 4 areas do not have the entirety even of water and mitigation. For example, hydropower is not included. But anyway, these are directly related. These are directly related to emissions reductions. It doesn't show the areas where water, a complete picture will show how the transformational activities required to mitigate climate change across the entire economy and planet will impact upon water or be dependent upon water to implement. That picture would show, instead of 10%, a vast majority of all the measures that we would take to mitigate climate change, to either sequester or to reduce emissions, will have a relevance to water. Next slide, please. That's why we began working on our report together with GIZ and many other partners to look broadly at how water will impact and be impacted by climate mitigation efforts. It tries to take the perspective of mitigation actions and then looking at what happens with water. It aims to provide a detailed overview of freshwater's role in achieving the Paris targets and getting to net zero. We're scheduled to have the draft with key messages presented for COP26 and a final published report in early 2022, hopefully by March. Next slide, please. In the report, we look at technology-based measures, which are generally emissions reducing, and nature-based measures, which are also referenced by Art, which often are storing and sequestering carbon, or preventing the release of emissions from carbon that is stored in the ecosystems when they're altered or destroyed. Next slide, please. And in the report, we look into the major areas that you find in mitigation planning, including the energy systems, forest and forestry, croplands and rangelands, which also include the food production and agricultural systems, freshwater ecosystems, which Noreen will talk about next, and also water treatment, supply, and sanitation systems. I will provide an overview of the research underway on that topic, which I think may be of highest interest to this group here. And this work is being led by colleagues at CIWI, namely Ricard Genet is the lead author of that chapter, and contributors from Stockholm and Bayer Institute, GIZ, and Gdansk University. I won't be able to go into too much detail on the technologies and measures within the time we have, but I'll provide a picture of the areas covered and a few key messages. Next slide, please. Globally, the IPCC estimates that at least 3% of greenhouse gas emissions come from waste and wastewater treatment. Greenhouse gas emissions from a water utility, they come from treatment processes, the release of potent nitrous oxide and methane gases, as well as carbon emissions resulting from energy use to power the operations. But if we look beyond the waste and wastewater, if we look at waste and wastewater beyond the treatment plants, we have poor data, but we have a good idea that is much more than 3%. That's because accounting of the methane and nitrous oxide emissions that come from untreated water is not well tracked. And a majority of wastewater is not adequately treated in the world. On average, high-income countries treat about 70% of wastewater, but in middle-income countries, it's closer to 38%, and maybe as low as 8% in low-income countries. This underlies a major issue, but also an opportunity. There is considerable know-how in the water sector, but there's chronic underinvestment, and traditionally there's little focus on this as a mitigation opportunity. And the value of that investment you can also see looking at the US and Europe. If you compare the data of nitrous oxide and methane emissions from the US EPA and the European Environment Agency over the past 30 years, it gives a glimpse of the picture. In the US, for example, methane emissions were stable between 1990 and 2005. In the last 15 years, decreased by about 20%. Nitrous oxide emissions were gradually increasing between 1990 and 2015 by about 35% in total, and then stabilized. This is explained by increasing US population and protein consumption. But if we look at the EU over the same overall period, methane emissions actually decreased by 50%. Nitrous oxides emissions decreased by almost 17%. Most of these reductions were attributed to investment in the implementation of new wastewater technologies and processes. Next slide, please. So this reveals that investment will make a difference on these areas. In the chapter that we're producing now, in the report, they highlight 8 different areas where mitigation can be done in water and wastewater management. These include optimize process selection and operational conditions of wastewater and fecal sludge treatment and discharge, enhancing wastewater collection and treatment, including decentralized solutions, energy efficiency measures, renewable energy investments, upgrading groundwater pumping, enhanced desalination processes to lower energy requirements for desalination, and a big one is energy recovery. These opportunity areas, of course, are not either or. They can work in concert to lower emissions and to achieve positive climate results. And while there's continued innovations in the sector, and these are important, each of these areas are more than achievable to improve with current know-how and technologies. Next slide, please. Okay. So in the chapter, some key overarching messages are coming out from what we're looking at. First, the investment in expanding and enhancing wastewater and sanitation management is critical for climate mitigation. Water and wastewater management also requires a lot of energy, but has a high energy generation potential. There's projections from the International Energy Agency, for example, where energy generation from wastewater globally can outpace energy demand. There's also major issues we need to look at. A big one is that we need more and better data and reporting of actual greenhouse gas emissions from water and sanitation management. And also, the WASH sector is very poorly represented in the climate policy debate and should be able to receive more than its current limited share of climate-related finance. In existing wastewater treatment plants, one insight that also looking into is that it seems that changing the operational conditions appears to be one of the most economical ways to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions without losing the required effluent quality. At least this is the case as being most economical in the short term. Some of the ways this can be done include aeration control, feed scheme optimization, and process optimization. And as we discuss these kinds of opportunities with high potential, we also need to remember the basics. Globally, improving the collection and treatment of water and decentralized solutions are needed as a human development requirement, but this also should be framed as a climate action. In the next presentation, Noreen will outline climate mitigations found in the management, protection, and restoration of freshwater systems. So we'll be taken into more detail there. This is an important point on what happens when polluted water isn't treated well enough. And the answer is it will emit a large amount of emissions and more than if it's treated. I'd also like to take a little bit of time to explain why it's so critical, not just how, but why it's so important that we take these opportunities in the water sector to mitigate emissions as much as we can, as quickly as possible, or as Al said it, turning these buts into and. Next slide, please. As individuals joining the session today, I think we all know what's important. I don't need to waste time outlining all the risks we already face with the warming climate. The photo on the left of Ida's devastation is but one example of so many we've seen this past year alone, and maybe even now is an old example. I also don't expect I need to appeal to your conscience, like my fellow Stockholm resident Greta Thunberg, for you to feel the importance to our planet, biodiversity, and future generations to getting emissions down. But instead, I want to appeal to you as a water manager, utility, or user. Next slide, please. Perhaps you hear of 3% emissions or 10% emissions, references to uncertain data, and things can make it feel like it's difficult to gauge how big your role really is and how much money and time this is really worth. I will try to provide some perspective on why we are at risk to have more problems to manage water if we don't do our part for climate mitigation. This requires looking at a bit more complicated image here that you see on the screen. But what you see here is a look at the pathways that are projected to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by mid-century. This is taken from the IPCC pathway report to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. These are the ones here, mostly the two on the left, that make it to the finish line on the race to zero emissions. I would just speak broadly about this, but catching up and implementing these transformations is a massive undertaking. And looking at these scenarios, they bring us just in line to do it. And each of the measures for the mitigation chosen and the paths taken will have huge ramifications on water worldwide. And perhaps more poignantly, water will have huge ramifications on which measures will be available, achievable, or even beneficial. And for each of the different potentials not achieved within the pathways, we'll need overperformance and greater use from others if we are to hit the targets that we know are so important. And some of the assumptions on some of these pathways are dramatic. Changes in diets, incredible improvements in energy efficiency so that we can produce more in the economy with less energy. And some of the choices for mitigation for how we produce energy, eat food, manage ecosystems can have huge implications for water. So the message home here is we need to exhaust all the other options that are lower risk for water first. And if you look at the chart that you can see here, you can see that the more emissions that we continue to have, the more we're going to need natural system solutions to sequester the carbon and store it. And if you look at the gray bar, the method considered with the largest potential application is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, called BECCS. This is also one of the measures that has the largest demand for water resources, which will either constrain its applications or compete with other needs. In the IPCC report on pathways to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, they found the median for scenarios for use of BECCS and bioenergy was 150% more than the scientists believe were feasible with existing land or resources. There's still a lot of uncertainty and a lot to figure out here, but clearly we must avoid being left dependent on riskier options for climate mitigation. Bioenergy and BECCS are just one example, and a dramatic one. Across the options for mitigations, there's implications for water, which we really need to mainstream. We really need to mainstream so that water assessment is happening across mitigation development and overall investment planning. We also can't miss the opportunities in front of us to mitigate climate change, because again, many of the things in the energy mix might have significant implications on water resources. Next slide, please. So I will try to close with a couple simple takeaway messages. First, there is a lot you can do in your role, and there's a lot that needs to be done. Investments and actions taken domestically and through international development to improve wastewater management is significant for climate mitigation. And functional utilities in water treatment are critical to global development, and they reduce emissions. They're frontline defense against increased emissions as well. This is missed in how we finance climate action and potentially our greenhouse gas emission accounting, and also maybe an opportunity to finance things in the future. And finally, we should take responsibility, take action, but also credit for reducing emissions through water management, both through reducing carbon footprints of energy and producing bioenergy, but also the basics in reducing methane and nitrous oxide that is captured when treated. And finally, we need to link water into mitigation planning. The paths to climate mitigation and resilience are tricky and unpredictable. Every missed opportunity to mitigate may imply a water risk later. And finally, think of ways that you can engage to ensure that mitigation planning in your area considers water in the short, medium, and long term. Water budgets and assessments are a first part that should be part of all mitigation planning at all scales. Okay, next slide, please. And with that, I thank you for your time. I look very much forward to the discussions. Thanks again.
Thank you, Josh. Really appreciate your input here. This is very valuable. I'd like to turn it over now to our colleague, Noreen Anisha.
Thank you, Ward. Hello, everyone. I am Noreen Anisha. I am a doctoral candidate at Oregon State University, and I specialize on water resources and its overlap with climate change. Thank you, Josh, for giving an overview about the report that we are writing. In that report, I'm leading the chapter on the role of freshwater systems in climate mitigation, and it entails understanding utilization of freshwater systems as a greenhouse gas sink, but also understanding them as how they work as sources. So I would like to give you a perspective about the freshwater system, which kind of often gets very much overlooked when we talk about water-based climate mitigation. We like to talk about wastewater, agricultural water, the wash sector, and definitely the energy sector, but the freshwater system-based climate mitigation efforts are getting traction in recent years, but we definitely need to step up as we are already in our net zero race. I have divided this discussion into 4 parts for your understanding. I'm going to give you a general idea about the role of freshwater systems. And by freshwater systems, I mean wetlands, and wetland can entail, and by definition of wetlands, almost all aquatic environments are counted as wetlands. But here by wetlands, we particularly mean peatlands, marshes, swamps, bogs, fens, mangroves, seagrasses, and by inland water, we mean rivers, stream, lake, reservoir, ponds. And then I'm going to give you a context for the US, since we have a lot of audiences from the US. I'm going to highlight some positive actions, particularly from the US, and then maybe how we can navigate it and what we are looking forward to as we embark on our journey to net zero by 2050. Firstly, a brief idea about how water works as greenhouse gas sources and sinks. Firstly, I would like to elaborate on the wetlands. As I said, for wetlands, we talk about, we mean peatlands, swamps, bog, fens, marshes, mangroves, and more. Almost all aquatic environments can be considered wetlands. But here, for particularly this session, I'm going to highlight our freshwater wetlands and peatlands, and a little bit about blue carbon ecosystems. Not going to elaborate a lot on it here. So intact wetlands function as vital storage mechanism of carbon and greenhouse gases. And, for example, peats cover about 3% of the global land surface, only 3%, but can store about 30% of the terrestrial carbon. So, they have huge carbon sequestration potential. And blue carbon ecosystem, which is like the salt marshes, the seagrass, the mangroves, they are huge carbon storages. The thing is, these wetlands, which we're referring as wetlands here, have huge potential to sequester carbon, but have great ecosystem benefits, give you benefits for disaster risk reduction, for climate change adaptation. And definitely carbon sequestration comes with it. Although wetlands have been so useful to us as a civilization for thousands of years, it is the fastest declining ecosystem in the world, declining 3 times faster than forests. Now, between 1970 to 2015, natural inland and coastal wetlands both declined by approximately 35% around the world. Meanwhile, human-made wetlands have almost doubled, but which are mostly the human-made wetlands? The rice paddies, the reservoirs. Both rice paddies and reservoirs are actually greenhouse gas sources. About 15% of world's peatlands have been trained for agriculture, forestry, and grazing. And degraded peatlands, not just peatlands, any wetlands. Wetlands are carbon storages. They, sequester the carbon, not just what we emit today, but they have been, stocking these carbons, have been keeping them for thousands of years. So when we don't take care of our wetlands, we disturb them or drain them, we actually emit all the carbons from the past, and we also lose our carbon stock or the carbon storages for the future, the natural storages we had. So that's why wetlands are so much important on this net zero race. Here is a figure for you that how drainage of peatlands actually harm us, in the long run, harm the environment. But as you can see, it's like, first of all, 10% of the global greenhouse gas emission from the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector are caused by draining of peatlands. If peatlands, get caught on fire, it kind of, that fire persists for months, and that actually burns all the organic carbon that are in the peatland. When intact peatlands are drained, carbon losses through water increases by 50%. And then there's definitely the biodiversity loss and other kind of environmental impacts. Here's a quick overview of how the peatlands around the world look, in 2008. You can see I've highlighted the peat area in the USA. So USA is like has the fourth largest area of peatlands in the world, and you can see that if you see the carbon stock emission from those peatlands, it does not include the peatlands from Alaska, though. It is not doing as bad as Indonesia, but definitely not doing as good as Canada as well. So there's definitely room for improvement over there. Now coming to the rivers, rivers can work as both source and sink. Now the trick with rivers are that we don't have a lot of study about rivers. We know there are evidences that rivers do emit carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, all the major main greenhouse gases, but we don't have any concrete study, a structured study about how they emit it, why they emit, and what are the conditions that make rivers emit. There are very scattered studies on different rivers in different parts of the world. We try to accumulate it and try to understand, but that's probably not the right way to go about it. And this is what is highlighted in the IPCC report that just came out earlier this month. Actually earlier last month, so that we don't know our rivers. So it is found that several studies do reinforce this idea that nutrient input leads most rivers in the world to be super saturated with greenhouse gas, resulting in net sources. But there's this one study on Congo River Basin that says that rivers can also behave as nitrous oxide sinks, particularly when they're connected to wetlands. Stream and river dissolved carbon dioxide originates, from different sources. It can be terrestrial ecosystem and the carbon that comes from there, the soil carbon, also the nutrient input from the watershed, which can come from urbanization, from wastewater treatment plants, from agricultural use. Now, rivers and understanding them as a greenhouse gas source, it has not been talked about a lot. It has just got traction in the last 10 years. Lakes and reservoirs, on the other hand, have been talked about for a long time, particularly because of the algal blooms for the eutrophications. The emission from lentic waters like lakes or reservoirs are equivalent to roughly 20% of global carbon dioxide fossil fuel emission. A global study on almost 800 lakes and reservoirs around the world suggests that they're generally super saturated with greenhouse gases, and shallow lakes tend to release more greenhouse gases compared to deep lakes. And the interesting thing about lakes and reservoirs, or most lentic water, in some cases even for rivers with low discharge, is that there's a positive feedback loop. And this diagram actually kind of explains it, that when there is greenhouse gas emission, there is climate change, there's higher temperature, change in rainfall. So what it does is it increases the surface water temperature. And when there is more nutrient flowing into the water, it makes more algal bloom, and this algal definitely emit a lot of greenhouse gases, and that greenhouse gas gets into the atmosphere, changes the climate furthermore, and this positive feedback loop goes on. Human activities and global warming, both increase inland water methane emission, not just in lakes and reservoirs, but also in our rivers. Here is a diagram that describes that this is a river. The first diagram is before pre-impoundment, before a dam is set up on a river. And the second one is what happens when a dam is put on a river. So firstly, you see there are agricultural input and nutrient loading from agriculture, nutrient loading from urban settlements, and that do make rivers emit to a certain extent. But when you put a dam on it, what happens is there's a lot of sediment accumulation that kind of triggers more greenhouse gas emission, not just through the not natural degassing from the surface, but the methane bubbling, or which we call evaluation, diffusive emission, and degassing in the downstream. So we don't already understand our rivers and their emissions, and we're probably making it worse when we're building dams on them. So how is the context for US? So this is a map, and I'm really sorry, there are a lot of text on my slide. It's for all of you who probably would like to go through the slides after the symposium. So for your better understanding, I wanted to make sure that whoever goes through it understands it. Anyway, so for the context of the US, the first map on the top left is all the different kind of wetlands across United States. And you can see that United States has a lot of wetlands across it. And this is the contiguous United States, and the one on the right is for Alaska. Very interesting thing, if you see the contiguous US, the one that I've circled, the total, the carbon stock in all of wetlands in the contiguous US is 13.55 pentagram carbon per year, or pentagram carbon. And for Alaska, just Alaska alone, it's almost more than twice. And one thing to be mentioned, that 46% of the wetland in Alaska are within their permafrost area. And this is an important information, and I will elaborate on it later. Again,
Nisha, just a quick comment, just a time check, about another 3 or 4 minutes yet.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I know this is just a context, how things, what are the latest research say about US, and how things are, how much the carbon stocks are in the US. I'll not elaborate on this. Again, for inland waters, there are very few studies on rivers in the world, and even fewer in the US. Something you can, count with, very easily, very, and we don't have information about all the 3 different greenhouse gas that rivers can emit. There is one study about reservoirs and their emissions in the US, but then again, the seasonal variability, the hydrologic variability, all these things have not been integrated in those studies. So there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of studies to be done on our inland waters. I will probably skip this slide. So there are some positive actions that have been taken in the US that can probably be very inspiring for the water professionals and the researchers in the US, but it can also be very good examples and case studies for the rest of the world who are trying to act on their freshwater systems. So I kind of, the American Clean Water Act, the Wetland Reserve Program, all these programs have actually protected America's wetlands. And which is a very great news is that the current rate of loss of wetlands is 23 times less than that of the historical trend back from in 1970s till 1980s. So it's a great job that America is doing. There are 2 examples. One is of Minnesota, which has 6 million acres of peatlands. Highest number of peatlands compared to any other state in the contiguous US. And these peatlands are unaltered untouched, taken care of. So there you go, you're protecting your carbon stocks, not for today. You're not just, helping us by not emitting them, but also, you're preserving them, and they're going to work as the future natural storages. Another example was in Tampa Bay, Florida, of seagrass recovery through continuing nutrient management. Even though Tampa Bay had population influx of 1.1 million since 1980 till 2014, their nutrient loading has gone down, and that has happened through different processes of minimizing nutrient loading. And their seagrass has improved by 65%. The entire recovery goal that was adopted in 1996 have been achieved in 2014. So which is great. Now, what are we looking forward to? And, what are the things we can do with our freshwater based mitigation? Definitely, it starts with understanding our greenhouse gas sources and how they work, in what conditions they emit, in what conditions they don't emit or emit less, in what conditions they work as sink, and also the ones that we know as our sink. We have to learn how to protect them right. So understanding the nutrient and the organic matter input, having a watershed scale approach to our rivers, to our wetlands, to even our groundwater, understanding how they work in a coupled way. Secondly, considering the impacts of changing climate. That's what I was talking about when I was talking about Alaska, that 46% of Alaska's wetlands and carbon storages are still in a permafrost, right? And this permafrost are thawing. When permafrost thaw, they actually emit methane. And when temperature increase, our lakes are going to emit more greenhouse gas because of eutrophication. So we cannot take decision based on our historical climate anymore. We have to consider where we are now and where we are heading with our current trajectory. Then nature-based solutions, which Josh also mentioned, which U.S. Army Corps of Engineers call engineering with nature, understanding that sequestering carbon is one of the many co-benefits that our freshwater systems have. Freshwaters have many co-benefits, starting from biodiversity protection to disaster risk reduction. And the essential idea of nature-based solution is not you eliminate gray solution, but you realize the importance of natural solutions, and you try to integrate them as much as you can. Definitely, we need broader understanding of emission from inland water. We have to understand the seasonal variability, the climatic variability, because what we can see, based on the existing knowledge, is that you cannot generalize rivers. Different rivers are acting differently. Some are sink, some are source. So we need to do more research and understand it better. And definitely the last one is one of the recent debates we have, that can we really consider our hydropower clean energy sources? Hydropowers come with dams, and we can see that even though hydropower probably would not emit as much as other fossil fuel energy sources, but they do make the freshwater systems emit in other ways. So maybe it's time we consider our other clean energy options and think about them and take them more seriously. I would wrap it up here. Thank you so much. And for any questions, you can email me in this email address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noreen. I really appreciate that input. It's fantastic. So I'd like to open the conversation now for a few minutes in the time that we have remaining to address several of the questions that some of you have posted into the chat. And I would like to go back to one that was posted early on by David Dow, and had to do with the issue about whether or not the warming of the ocean has increased the community respiration. I think it's an interesting question because it has to do with this model known as MAGIC, and that's just for acronyms purposes. It's a model for the assessment of GHG-induced climate change. And it's fascinating to look at the budgets that they're putting together with that. So Josh, maybe if you can address that first, that would be great.
Well, I have no idea. I think maybe Noreen is more of a hydrologist than I am. So I can't really answer that question. But I think it raises again back to the greater point that I was trying to make, that they're using these integrated assessment models to make all these projections and pathways, but there is so much uncertainty in so many of these areas about what we'll be able to do or whether the impacts will be greater, that it just brings you back to the common conclusion that everything you know that you can do to mitigate or sequester carbon, we should invest in, that we need to do all angles because we don't know. There's still a huge amount of uncertainty. And even within these models, I was going to make a larger point, about it's not everywhere where the considerations for water and impacts are able to be considered, so I think that's the best I can do. But you can follow up with me. I'm actually going to have a discussion with people at IASA that are involved in integrated assessment modeling. Maybe I can forward them your question and they can actually answer it.
Thank you. Noreen, did you want to comment on that one at all?
Question again, please.
It has to do with what the future atmospheric conditions will be as a result of ocean warming and how that affects natural systems, and whether that's going to be included in these assessment model budgets, or has it been included, and if so, when?
I can answer from my knowledge, particularly for freshwater or rivers. That is, we often talk about it that the water and air saturation kind of is like, if the atmospheric saturation is higher, then water is probably going to sequester or sink some of it. And if the water is higher than atmosphere, then it's definitely going to emit. So yeah, definitely there is some bearing on it, and there's still research going on how nitrous oxide is acting, and how and why it's acting differently for different rivers, differently for different reservoirs. For say, just in the United States, a study on 32 reservoirs says some reservoirs work as sources. 1/3 of those reservoirs acted as sink. And it's still so unvariable, and that's what IPCC says, that it's ambiguous and it's uncertain. There's no solid science behind it. So definitely we need to give more attention to our natural water systems.
Good comment. And so that's a great segue then into Dali Wettermark's question, and it was had to do with this capture and incentivizing for methane and nitrous oxide capture at facilities and untreated wastewaters. And so you referenced this a bit, Josh, in your comments, and I want to start with you in terms of the question here is really around, does this now drive some incentives toward carbon pricing?
I mean, it should. I think there's also a question of whether it's carbon pricing or taxing or credits, right? And I think we also maybe have a bit of a, I shouldn't say philosophical, but a bit of a philosophical question, about if the waste is going into the system, and then it is the water utility who's managing it, are they getting credit for any reductions they make from what would ultimately happen if nothing happened, right? Or are they paying taxes on whatever amount they do not achieve, right? And what is the best process for doing it? I think one of the things we're talking about, like at the global level, it's ridiculous that we should even need to talk about wastewater treatment as a climate issue to address the wastewater crisis in the world, right? But it might be a reality that will be useful. It's also a different way that we work with things. If you make an investment in hydropower, right? You take the energy that you produce and then you compare that energy production against the emissions that would come from coal. And then you call it a reduction. It's a completely different philosophy. For wastewater, you have to take the waste, you have to turn it into an energy. When you have that clean energy, then you count the amount that energy produces versus coal, and then you take a reduction. So I think we also need to sort of fundamentally fix this a little bit, so we can look at from the first place, how much pollution will be coming into our systems? How do we pay to reduce that? And what are the double benefits?
Great comment. Yeah. Noreen, would you like to comment on that? So I think obviously nitrous oxide and methane out of peatlands, for example, and natural wetlands, as you pointed out in your presentation, is a big part of this energy era of this CHG balance. So just curious what your comments would be.
I'm not a very energy utility person, so I don't know how well I can comment on that. Yeah, I don't think I'm a very suitable person to comment on that.
No worries. There was a great question regarding desal, which you referenced in your comments, Josh. And I would say that, yes, it is a tricky question with regards to augmented water supplies, whether they're augmented raw water supplies or actual in the DPR and IPR arenas, using desal as a way to do that. Of course, these are high energy systems, so it sort of works against what we're seeing as a means by which of minimizing emissions, right? So, but I would say that the enhancement in membrane technology to reduce some of the pressure, particularly on seawater RO, has really advanced quite a bit just within the last 5 years. We're also looking at technological changes in the way these RO systems are being designed and built, with multiple stage systems to get much higher recovery. The traditional RO kind of approach for saltwater desal has been typical recoveries in the 55–58% range. We're now able to push that more up into 74 to 76%, which is increasing the recovery, and still struggling with some of the higher pressures that are required to get to these recovery levels. So it is a tricky question. It is still very much part of any utility that is in a water scarce area on a sea, on a coastline, for example, to have it part of their water management plan. So it's a tough balance, and appreciate the question very much. I think it's an important one for this discussion. Are there any other comments that you would have, Josh or Noreen, regarding desal? Okay, I would like to pose one more question from Saeed, and that is, are technological solutions in development that will chemically entrap emissions in water without impacting biodiversity? So I'll start with you, Noreen, because I think this is in an area that you're very familiar with.
There are some research going on about it, for sure. And we know, like, IPCC talks pretty detailed this time about carbon trapping from the atmosphere. And there are some technologies for nutrient recovery from reservoirs, from our lakes. There have been some measures to prevent eutrophication, but particularly for river, because river is a very critical ecosystem because it's a biological body, chemical body, carries sediment, carries microbial functions and everything. It's about quality and about quantity, and everything along the basin actually depends on all of those dynamics. So I'm not sure, and as far as I know, there are no technology so far, but I'm sure that's the imagination challenge we have.
Good comment. I agree. Thank you. Josh, there was a question here from my colleague Al Cho about how well established are our methodologies for quantifying and measuring process emissions and in verifying those reductions. You had referenced this.
Yeah, and again, I'm leading the energy chapter, I'm not a water treatment expert per se, but I do know that one of the comments was writing that we need actual emissions from the wastewater treatment plants globally. So I feel like this part of the chapter is pointing to an issue here. And I do know that there is like technical services, even within Sweden, within the Research Institute of Sweden, they have a project where they go and do this at the plant level, you know? So I think this is, I think it's an area that at least globally certainly needs to be improved, and, you know, but I'm not sure. Al, I can put you in touch with the rest of the authors and give you a better answer on what exactly the issues are there.
Okay, well, thank you for your comments, and thank you all for your questions. We can continue to have these questions addressed in other parts of our symposium. I would end up here and just ask you, Josh, if you could give the group an indication of when you feel like this report will be published. and when the expectation for that can be published.
So like I mentioned during the presentation, but I can repeat here, so there's a lot of things said. So basically right now, the report is having the chapters reviewed for the most part. We have the, so through a scientific review process, we aim to have the draft done by COP26, where we'll be presenting the results more than I did here today, and then sort of the published final report we expect maybe in time for around World Water Day, so March next year.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Josh and Noreen, for your input. Really appreciate it. Back to you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Art, Noreen, and Josh. I know that I've been hearing that, number of 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions are related to water. And so it's really interesting to dive into that number and where the knowns and the unknowns are. And really one of my big takeaway messages from this session is that there's a lot we can do right now in the water sector to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And Josh, as you said, every missed opportunity to mitigate may imply a water risk later. So thank you for those insightful presentations. Thanks, Art, for moderating. Well, welcome back, everyone. And before we take a longer break for lunch or breakfast or dinner, depending where you are in the world, we have a tremendous panel lined up for you. And it's my pleasure to welcome Torgny Holmgren, James Dalton, and Kate Lamb to today's symposium. I'm actually going to introduce them in reverse order of speaking, and then we'll dive in to hear what they have to say. So Kate Lamb is with us, and she is the Global Director for Water Security for the Carbon Disclosure Project. She has built the world's largest coalition of non-state actors working to deliver a water secure future and is responsible for corporate water-related disclosures at CDP. Kate is also the UNFCCC's COP26 high-level climate action champions lead for water. And champion is a really appropriate descriptor here, as Kate herself is advancing the water community's ambition and elevating the value of water in the transition to a zero carbon resilient world. We're also joined by Dr. James Dalton, Director of the Global Water Program for the International Union for Conservation of Nature. James has been an expert in water resource management issues for over 20 years. Prior to IUCN, he worked with the Pacific Islands Applied Geoscience Commission, ITAD Water, and the Department of International Development's Water Advisors in London. An engineer by training, James has expertise in groundwater management in the Aral Sea Basin. And finally, we're joined by Torgny Holmgren, Executive Director of the Stockholm International Water Institute, or SIWI. A Swedish national, Torgny brings over 30 years of experience in economic and development issues to this conversation. He is the former ambassador at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and head of the Department for Development Policy. He has also served as an expert and worked with the World Economic Forum, the World Water Council, the Gates Foundation, WaterAid, the World Bank, and even served as Sherpa in the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on global sustainability. So welcome to all three of you. And for our audience listening in, what you're about to hear from these three is a recap of some of the remarkable movement on water and climate mitigation that's taken place over the past year. From the Race to Zero dialogues to World Water Week to the Race to Zero campaign, and looking forward to COP26 in Glasgow this November. It's truly an honor to have all of your expertise in the room today. So for our audience, get ready. And of course, please put your questions in the chat as we go. Torgny, we'll start with you and hear a bit about what happened at World Water Week last month. Welcome. I think you're muted, Torgny.
Okay, here we go. Thanks, Katie. And thanks for the introduction. And dear symposium participants and dear friends, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the organizer of this great event. I strongly believe that water has a crucial role to play for mitigation and climate mitigation, and that the Imagination Challenge have a tremendous impact on that. We have no time to lose. In my work, I meet many people from the global water community, and there seems to be a strong shared conviction. As a community, we could and should do more to tackle climate change. Not least was this a frequent topic at the most recent World Water Week held here in Stockholm. And you see the backdrop of me is still the World Water Week backdrop. This year, we gathered around the theme of building resilience faster, and we had over 10,000 participants from 188 countries. Given its size and the long history of the World Water Week, it offers a great opportunity to follow both megatrends and rapid changes. So I would like to share with you some of the key lessons that I bring with me from this year's event. First, we see fast-growing interest in the links between water and climate. Maybe that goes without saying. More and more people are starting to understand that the climate crisis really is a water crisis. Global warming has an immense impact on the hydrological cycle, as stated in the most recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what is happening now, as I see, is that many actors and sectors in our societies are starting to notice this as well and feel the impact climate change is having on their activities and lives. This goes for farmers who have experienced more severe droughts to coastal city dwellers starting to worry about the rising sea levels. And cities of all sizes have discovered that their water and sewage systems were not built to cope with the kinds of floods that we have seen nowadays. At World Water Week, we do attract a broad group and diverse group of participants. Many actors and sectors are starting to realize their fundamental dependence on water. Here we have a great opportunity to work more closely across sectors to solve mutual problems. I see that increasingly more decision makers now see the need for investments in water infrastructure, and that they realize how important this is to the communities, businesses, and of course, families. The second trend coming out of the World Water Week is the need for all actors to develop a roadmap to net zero carbon emissions. I think we in the water sector, we have an important role to play here to support others with their transformation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But we also have a big job ahead to reduce our own. Let's face it, unsustainable management of water and wastewater is a major but often forgotten contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It is estimated that energy use, for instance, for water and wastewater activities accounts for some 4% of energy use worldwide on a global scale. And that could double by 2040. In addition, the release of untreated wastewater contributes to the formation of greenhouse gases such as methane and nitrous oxide. So we will need work hard to improve wastewater treatment and reduce the amount of energy used in this process. At the same time, we must strengthen the resilience of our systems because we are not prepared for the impact climate change will have. And we can no longer, anyone can no longer take access to clean water for granted, and we must expect more and more severe weather events. So how can we take on this gigantic challenge? That brings me to the third trend I would like to share from this World Water Week, the role of nature-based solutions. This is, of course, nothing new. We have talked about such solutions for quite some time, and we see more and more good examples of blue and green infrastructure. But to me, it's not happening fast enough. How come that our powerful solutions are still largely untapped? There are still many obstacles as regard that kind of regulations, outdated business models, and also rules for cost depreciation that favor green solutions over green ones. However, I do think we in fact have many of the solutions at hand. We just need to apply them. I think, therefore, that we right to feel a small glimmer of hope ahead of the climate meeting coming up in November in Glasgow. I have myself taken part in climate meetings for many years, and to be honest, it has sometimes been quite disheartening. the world has struggled to understand the magnitude of the problem, to summon up political will and to develop solutions. And part of the problem, I believe, that we have not been successful enough from the water community to explain the fundamental role that water plays to climate change. This seems to be changing now. Compared to just a couple of years ago, many more people are worrying about the climate crisis itself, but it's also high on the political and corporate agendas, with a growing number of governments and companies promising massive carbon cuts. Also, it's increasingly common to talk about the link between water and climate change. This is a game changer, I think. When people understand that the fundamental problem in global warming, how it alters the hydrological cycle, proper attention can be given to water-related climate solutions. At CIVI, we have been long working with governments and other actors to develop and implement water-related climate solutions. So ahead of COP26, we are also together with a number of organizations worldwide leading the creation of the first ever water pavilion at the global climate meeting. The pavilion itself will be in the heartland of climate negotiators. It gives us a great opportunity to make decision makers understand why water is so crucial to addressing climate change. And let me be clear why we are doing this. It's not about, it's nice to have a water sector represented at COP that we have had before. It's because we believe that the climate crisis can more effectively be addressed through the lens of water. As you know, it has been customary to mainly think of water as having to do with climate adaptation, not mitigation. But to us, that is too limited. At COP26, we will share initial findings from research showing that water is much more important for climate mitigation than previously believed. And we have joined forces with other leading organizations like UNEP, UNDP, Stockholm Resilience Center, and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research to get a better understanding of water's role for climate mitigation and to identify concrete solutions. We find that this can be done in at least three ways. One is working with nature, not against nature. By protecting and restoring ecosystems such as forests and wetlands, we can strengthen nature's ability to store carbon dioxide. So far, nature has been able to absorb half of the greenhouse gas emissions released by human activities. But there are signs that that ability is weakening. Many ecosystems are now so degraded that they could easily flip from carbon sinks to carbon emitters, making it much more difficult to reduce the effects of climate change. So, a top priority should be to preserve ecosystems that are on the brink of tipping over to become carbon emitters. Second, since there are very few human activities that don't rely on access to clean water, it's critical and crucial that all plans for new technologies and major transformations take into account how much water that will be required. This is often forgotten, unfortunately. Investments cannot get access to huge quantities of clean water for granted. They cannot take that for granted in the years to come. The third way is what you are doing right now and what we are doing right now, addressing how we in the water community can contribute to climate action, both mitigation and adaptation. We will find that many smart water solutions are able to achieve both at the same time. Investments in blue-green solutions can increase carbon sequestration while also reducing disaster risk reduction or disaster risks and improve both the quantity and quality of water. I do believe we are on the verge of a breakthrough for this type of thinking. And I would like to end by quoting one of the most inspiring speakers at the most recent World Water Week, Ms. Sandra Postel, who was the receiver, or is the receiver of this year's Stockholm Water Prize. She says that investing in a healthier water cycle may be the best insurance policy money can buy in this century of rapid change. I find this very true. Water is the best insurance policy and holds the key to a more sustainable future. So it's very inspiring to see your commitment to this, and I look very much forward to following the Imagination Challenge in the weeks to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Torgny, both for highlighting the challenges and opportunities as our understanding of water's fundamental role and, as our insurance policy for climate change is shifting. So let's turn it over to James now. And James, can you help us dive a bit more into those linkages between mitigation and resilience, and tell us about some of the dialogues you've been a part of this past year?
Sure, thanks very much, Katie. I think the best way for me to probably explain it is to talk to you a little bit about something called the Marrakesh Partnership, and you'll have to forgive me because there's quite a few acronyms involved in climate sphere, and I won't bore you too much with some of those, but maybe only a little bit. But this is really where this platform, as it stands, this partnership is really where water stakeholders come together and try and showcase, influence, scream perhaps at times, and engage with the broader international climate community. The Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action, as it is called, the MPGCA, it was launched in Morocco out of COP22 in 2016. And it had already existed at that point, but it was not really a formal structure. And the role of it is to try and put non-party stakeholders in the climate sphere to discuss solutions. And that's a bit of a mouthful, but by that I mean the fact that in the UNFCCC climate policy world, the annual COPs that take place, the Conference of the Parties, they are really about governments negotiating the text around the Paris Agreement and trying to encourage themselves, their own states, to achieve both mitigation and adaptation targets. What the Marrakesh Partnership aims to do is to allow non-governments into that engagement. So that is cities, it's private sector, it's academics, it's your farmer and your farmer group and your farmer entity, it's a supply chain, it's civil society, it's indigenous peoples, it's everybody who has an interest in trying to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and also adapt to some of the extremes that climate change can bring. And the idea is that this platform is represented at that global international level to be able to showcase, really importantly, examples of success, examples of action, as a way of trying to bring stakeholders together to be able to share lessons between stakeholder groups, but also between different countries. And it's really important to also pull the finance sector into that as well. So we can look at how finance can shape and change mitigation actions, how finance can shape the future through its investment choices and decisions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's very much aligned, therefore, to the Paris Agreement. And so it's aligned with supporting the countries as well with what they have decided is within something called their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, and their national adaptation plans. And the Marrakesh Partnership continues, irrelevant of which country is hosting the COP. So this year, we're obviously dealing with Glasgow. Next year, we'll be dealing with the next country and so on. And so it's really also about corralling the local institutions within the host country together to try and shape and understand what they're doing. What's their level of ambition? What are they doing about mitigating climate change? What's their interest on water? Now, there's a few structures around it, but I won't go into any of those details, but it has a thematic structure. So it focuses on land use, oceans and coastal zones, human settlements, transport, energy, industry, lots of other smaller subsectors, but also water. And it's taken a long time, surprisingly, some of you may think, for water to be recognized within the whole UNFCCC process. And one of the reasons for that is that people felt that most of the attention was on just purely reducing emissions from those big emitting industries and not on what do they need to help them reduce emissions. They need water resources. What do they have an impact on? They have an impact on water resources. What do they share with other water users? What do they share with other stakeholders? Sorry, they share water resources. So the role of water has gradually got improved understanding within this discussion around climate at that level. Of course, it could be better. Of course, we all would want to see, those of us working purely on water, to see water more elevated in the conversations, but it's also very traded off between different sectors. And part of the role that I've been working on for the last few years, and most recently with Kate, is to understand how do we ensure that water is better understood within these different thematic groups. So how is water understood as both an amplifier of mitigation actions for agriculture, but also a potential limiter as to how you mitigate climate change through agriculture? How relevant is it for large scale infrastructure or the hydropower industry? And how important is it for multiple different levels of industry, from cement production to aluminium smelting and steel production, and the development of plastics and chemicals? If water resources are not available due to climate change, how do those industries adapt? And how can those industries adapt and reduce their carbon footprint lower through working and understanding water resources and how they engage with it? Pumping water resources, for example, or cleaning pollution. So that's what the partnership is about. It's very much focused on developing something called the Climate Action Pathway. We have one of those now. I can share the link with people. There are a variety for these different thematic sectors. And these are vision documents that are designed to try and outline a 1.5 degrees centigrade climate resilient world in line with the Paris Agreement, that for us on water is focused purely on what can the global water community of practice do to try and achieve the Paris Agreement. So it has both immediate but also long-term actions that are identified in that. And it has a series of overarching milestones: 2021, 2025, 2030, and 2040 through to 2050, to try and give a sense of ambition and transition to get to 2050 to this 1.5 degrees centigrade world. It's very much also, and I really encourage people to take a look at it, about binding forces, that no one group of actors is going to be able to solve this alone. So we need to be able to work across communities of practice, across networks of actors and different sectors. And these pathways will be updated every year as we go on to get a better understanding over what's achievable. And we're really looking for targets, ambitions, what's come out of that that's going to be achievable going forward. What are those big industry-led or city-led initiatives that we know can help us both mitigate and adapt to climate change? And Kate, I think, is going to mention one of them in a minute. The actual structure of these, and I think this is one of the points you mentioned, questions you asked me at the beginning, Katie, is that it's key that these pathways retain both an adaptation perspective, but also a mitigation perspective. And I think over the last 10, 15 years, there's been less done on the role of water as something that can help us mitigate climate change, and much more on adaptation. I think that's also been something that the pathways this year have really tried to pull out, is what can be done far better and far faster through using water as a mitigation opportunity, through reducing that carbon load and investing also in water sources and natural systems. So the idea of these is they're science-led, they embrace diversity, different actors, different countries getting engaged in the whole process, but they have to be focused on users. So they shouldn't be conceptual. The idea is that we have to be able to put on the table at the climate COPs real solid actions and lessons learned and how to apply them. And just finally, the actual pathway is really structured very simply. It's about protection and restoring our systems. Our natural systems need protection and restoration, which is something that Tawny mentioned about natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions. It's also about understanding production and what do we produce from our freshwater systems and how do we use them, and where can we look at mitigation actions within that, and reuse, that reuse and of freshwater and the nutrients and the waste that we produce. And so therefore, how can that be brought into the equation for capturing nutrients, capturing water, reusing that, and not therefore damaging natural systems, but also then using energy to redo that again and again and again, when we can actually recycle and restore far cheaper, but we just have to find the mechanisms to be able to do that faster and more at a larger scale. Finally, these pathways are available online, and this actual Marrakesh partnership is an open process. It's available for anybody to join and engage with. Our role, my role, Kate's role is a bit different to mine, but our role is to steer and guide the development of these pathways over the course of the next few years, to ensure that we put something on the table that is practical and can be applied and speaks to climate stakeholders. And I think that's sort of my lasting point, really, is that climate stakeholders don't necessarily understand water, and they don't necessarily see water resources as the most important thing that they're dealing with, in particular around mitigation. And I think one of the key things is that this needs to be something that we're very aware of in how we communicate to the climate sphere, to the climate stakeholders, is the role of water is not all encompassing. It's a contributory factor, and they have to trade off many other issues themselves with greenhouse gas emissions. So putting water into the right context is key when it comes to broader climate community of practice as well. And that's what we're trying to focus on for COP26. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. And I want to come back to this question on nature-based solutions in a moment. But first, speaking of the role of water, I know for a lot of our participants, they've been hearing, the phrase race to zero and race to zero campaign. And so I want to turn it over to Kate Lamb for a few minutes here to talk a bit more about what is this race to zero all about, and specifically what is water's role in that. Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Katie, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me along. This is a really great event. I'm really pleased to be here. As you've already heard, my job, I've got a really big, long title, and my business card is now this long compared to this long as when I started the year. But I've been appointed about a year ago now to be the global lead for water within the high-level climate champions team. What this team is that it's ultimately aiming to deliver ambitious outcomes at this year's COP26 climate summit. And I've been working with James, Torgny and others to ensure that we boost ambition on water from governments around the world. Our hypothesis that sits behind all of this is one of an ambition loop. That is that when we showcase ambitious commitments on water from businesses, investors, youth scientists, and a whole wide range of different segments of society, that this will in turn result in ambitious action on water from governments themselves. We all know, and you know better than I do in lots of ways, that many governments are not necessarily prioritizing investment in water infrastructure or the systems and architecture required to ensure that water is where it needs to be, when it needs to be, for the most sustainable purposes. And so we need to send a loud, resounding signal at COP26 that this needs to change. And governments are ultimately more likely to commit to move further and move faster on water if they know that a large part of society is behind them. We saw this play out in real time in Paris, and we're aiming to create the same level of ambition and momentum at Glasgow in just 7 weeks. So I want to talk to you today about the central role that water utilities play in helping us win this race to zero emissions, and ultimately also a race to a more resilient world. Water is the lifeblood of the economy. It's the element that binds us together, creating deep and complex interdependencies between communities, companies, and natural ecosystems. Changing the way that we use, distribute, store, and treat water holds the key to delivering the net zero resilient future that we all need, indeed, that we all deserve. As guardians of large volumes of water and water-related ecosystems and infrastructure, water and wastewater utility firms have a leading role to play in the race to a better future. And in light of the recent IPCC AR6 report, it's safe to say that the time for business as usual approaches to water and wastewater management is over. COP26 for us represents the last chance to course correct before humanity faces the worst effects of climate change. The water and wastewater sector emit about the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions as the entire shipping sector. And this figure is set to more than double by 2040 as demand increases for scarce water supplies. At the same time, globally, vast amounts of wastewater is currently leaving sites untreated, releasing significant amounts of greenhouse gases as it biodegrades. We're missing vital opportunities to harness the power of this wastewater and turn it into new sources of energy and nutrients, not to mention, of course, alternative sources of water in times of scarcity. The water and wastewater sector has a vital role to play in enabling the world to thrive, in changing this business as usual. I think we can all agree that the future painted by the IPCC report is not one that we want to live in. Indeed, it's not one that we can really live in if we're fundamentally honest with ourselves. And so the time for more ambition is now. For example, the 50 largest utilities serve over 1 billion people worldwide. The actions that they will take will directly affect the ability of those people to survive the worst effects of climate change. What an amazing opportunity. We could get those top 50 companies in one room or one Zoom call together and potentially affect the outcome for 1 billion people worldwide. To succeed, therefore, the sector must take urgent transformational steps to become net zero and resilient as quickly as possible. As such, I'm on a mission alongside Katie, Al, James, Torgny, and many of my peers that you'll be hearing from today, in order to get as many water utility companies on board to make net zero commitments ahead of this year's COP26 summit in Glasgow, just 7 weeks from now. We need your ambition, we need your commitments in order to send that loud, resounding signal to governments the world over that it is possible to achieve net zero, and that the water utilities sector is standing ready to play their part in helping them to deliver it. We know that many of you will have already made great inroads into your sustainability plans, and we're seeing amazing engagement from those utilities that have already joined us in the race. Whether that's harnessing the power of wastewater, as I've already mentioned, to rewilding source water protection areas, from greening your fleet and electricity supplies, to enhancing the resilience of distribution networks. There is so much potential to be tapped. We're seeing leadership emerge, particularly in the UK, where a large number of UK water and wastewater utilities have committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2030, just 9 years away. That's 20 years earlier than they're mandated by law to do so. This is the type of leadership that the water community can inspire. And this is the type of leadership that I'm hoping will inspire amongst all of you today. As I mentioned earlier, we know that many of you will have already made great inroads into your sustainability plans. Some of you may even have already set net zero targets or are about to begin embarking on this vital exercise. I want to be able to shout loudly about your efforts, champion these at the highest level, and demonstrate your commitment and leadership at COP26. I can't do this, however, if you do not formally sign up to join us in the race. There is literally a form for you to fill. It's quite short, it's free, so let's get going. We have now more than 20 utilities signed up, but we do need more. Luckily, there is still time to get involved. You can visit www.water.org.uk/race to zero to find out more, and I'll include a link in the chat in a moment. As I've already mentioned, COP26 represents the last best chance to course correct before humanity faces the worst effects of climate change. We heard from Liv Garfield, CEO of Severn Trent, last week, that the planet and humanity needs our help today, not in 20 years' time. During that same event, we heard that we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to deliver the transformation that we all know is possible. It seems to me that there's never been a better time for ambitious action on climate right across the whole water sector. How lucky are we that we get to be the ones to solve this challenge? So I do hope you seize this opportunity to be a significant part of the climate solution. Please harness your imagination and join us in the race to zero. We are under starters orders, so it's time to get your running shoes on. Thanks, Katie. Back to you.
Thank you, Kate. And I did put a link a little preemptively for the race to zero in the chat, so folks can find that there. So we have a few more minutes before our next break, and I'd like to return to the topic of nature-based solutions, because that's something that was mentioned by all three of you. And I think it's so crucial, not just for the mitigation question, but as James highlighted, for some of these really critical interlinkages with resilience and water supply and ecosystems and water reuse, really. So we have a question in the chat from Christine Hahn, who's wondering if, some of you could share some examples or some of the low-hanging fruit or easiest solutions for states to implement right now. What would you recommend for states looking at advancing nature-based solutions that also contribute to mitigation efforts? And James, perhaps we'll start with you, and then we'll open up for Kate and Torgny.
Sure. No, it's a really good question, and it's one that does tax the mind in many ways, because you can apply nature-based solutions at a variety of different scales. You can do some small-scale community engagement, or a wetland restoration or peatland restoration, for example. But the actual impact of that is very local. It's all contributing in terms of a mitigation perspective, but it's not going to be at the ambition level that we really need unless you do that across the planet. I think the key thing then from a state's perspective is, one, to have a look at your existing policy environment that you have, and where are you actually hindering nature-based solutions being used as part of the suite of options that you have available to you, in particular from a mitigation perspective. So where are they not included or disincentivized in the policy environment for municipalities, investors, companies, landowners to be able to work with nature-based solutions? So that's probably step one. I think step two is always a very sensitive one, but there are more subsidies that go to actually harming the environment than there are those that go to protecting it and restoring it. So I think looking at the subsidy set as well, and to understand how they can have perverse incentives and knock-on effects on natural systems, in particular those that are really important for storing carbon, such as wetlands, peatlands, forests, etc., is really, really important as well. And then third, I think, is to look at where you've got potential for investment, both from a public sector perspective, but also from a private sector perspective, as to where there is interest to invest in nature-based solutions, either to work within a company or a municipality's footprint, for example, if you like, its local environment, but also where it sees it's got a supply chain that it might want to also invest in around nature-based solutions and options. That could be through sustainable forest management, it could be through improvements in groundwater recharge, a variety of different topics, all which can help build water security, but they can also help mitigate emissions. I hope that gives you just a bit of an overview.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Torgny or Kate, do one of you want to add anything?
I think James covered incredibly comprehensively the three major areas that a state could take. One signpost I think that I would like to put in the ground is that there are a number of civil society actors that have got funds and infrastructure in place or architecture in place to help states and other actors to begin exploring these issues and to find new exciting alternative sources of funding to enable these to be realized. One is the Nature Conservancy with their water funds. And WWF has also got a whole program of work aiming to build a pipeline of projects that will ultimately enable states and cities in particular to invest in nature-based solutions. So there are vehicles out there, I think, that states can adopt in order to help advance this. They don't have to work independently of each other in order to succeed.
Torgny, you're on mute again.
Sorry, yeah, let me build on that and not repeat. I think what good Kate and Jameson was perfect for answering the questions. The question, I see also the number of proposals in the chat, because there are some low-hanging fruits. Yes, but low-hanging fruits takes a decision to be made, and maybe that is not the quick fix. But I think we can be very helped by nature-based solutions in the urban areas with urban forests, wetlands, parks, rivers, etc., stormwater catchment areas, in the floodplains absorbing excess rainwater, but also in coastal areas like mangrove forest in that part of the world, then you can protect your forest or protect your coast. So I think there are a number of low-hanging fruits, but low-hanging fruits are not just to grab them. You have to take as James said, this is a kind of planning also, and also with the economic part of it, as Kate also underscored, that to take a decision, to make our decision makers to really see the opportunities. And we can learn a lot from our colleagues in the Netherlands, how they take care of water or redirect water. But I also think in the chat, I see both from my colleague Josh and others have also pointed to a number of sites where you can find more about that. And I think IUC and your website is really good on NBS. I think if you really would like to dig into these possibilities. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that point on decision making is really important around, economic opportunities as well. And James, in your answer just a minute ago, you referenced some of the opportunities around supply chains in the private sector, which I'm wondering if we can expand just for a moment on Justin Hart's question in the chat. And if any of you could comment on other opportunities you're seeing involving the private sector and within the water sector to collaborate on reducing scope 3 emissions in shared supply chains. Kate, we'll go to you first.
Thank you, Katie. I can speak to that. Taking my climate champions hat off and putting my CDP hat on, we now have over 10,000 companies disclosing water and climate related data across their businesses. A number of those are now working together through CDP to tackle scope 3 emissions in their supply chains. And what they're finding is that clearly a number of the main buyers, main purchasers share the same suppliers. And so they're coming to get these buyers would often operate independently and put different asks into suppliers that may enhance or undermine a supplier's ability to respond to their buyer's expectations. And of course, the supplier wants to do that. They want to keep their customers happy. But it's very difficult when you've got competing demands from different buyers coming in, all somewhat similar, but not quite the same thing. And so we at CDP are working with these companies, with the buyers, to ensure that there's a consistent set of expectations being placed on the suppliers where they are shared, and that the push, therefore, and the support required, the incentive for suppliers to act is much more powerful when they're collectively operating in that way. So I'd say CDP is obviously one space where that can happen, but there will inevitably be other interventions across the US in particular where this type of activity can take place. It does require, however, quite a different mindset, right? You need to be in a position of a pre-competitive space where you are willing and able to share intelligence and insights with potentially your competitors, all in the interest of enabling everybody, all boats to row, all boats to float, and all boats to rise. And that's not always easy for companies who are born and bred and raised to beat the other guy or beat the other girl. We're going to make that product better than that product company is going to be. And so it's really encouraging to see this type of collaboration taking place. It's not easy, but I think with the right mindset coming into it, with the knowledge that climate resilience for the suppliers and ultimately then for the companies, the buyers themselves, is the overall end game, then you can have some really productive conversations.
Thank you so much for that. And we are just about at time. So we have some great questions from David and Saeed in the chat, which I'm going to encourage the audience to help crowdsource with one another and share some ideas. And to close out with all three of you, I just want to do a very quick round, since we are so grateful to have you here as leaders in this field and really as champions around water and climate. You know, coming from the young professionals perspective, which I am bringing here today, I want to know just a quick round as we head into COP26 and water's role at COP, what's giving you hope? Let's start with Kate, then we'll go to James, and we'll finish up with Torgny.
Thank you, Katie. The sense of hope and optimism is vital, because without it, I could not get out of bed every day. The situation is incredibly dire, and the warnings in the AR6 report could not be starker. And so it's vital that we harness that frustration and turn it into hope and optimism. And I'm seeing some really impressive leadership emerging, whether that's from the youth collective. So I was on a call just last week with the World Youth Parliament, who are about to get their 3,000 members from across the world to sign a public letter declaring that they are thirsty for change and they want governments to act on water. The leadership we're seeing, climate leadership we're seeing emerging from the water sector itself, I could not be more proud to be able to showcase that. And we are the leading sector on the planet. I cannot overstate what a fabulous position we find ourselves in. You know, we're beating food and bev, oil and gas, energy, transport, shipping. Nobody else is committing to net zero as quickly as the water sector is. And that is a real source of pride. And finally, I think seeing the water community writ large, that to date has been relatively siloed, you know, either by country or by very specific thematic areas, coming together to share in a common collective call for greater levels of ambition at COP26 is the other reason why I'm feeling really quite optimistic at the moment. So thank you.
Yeah, I think building on Kate's points, I think the water community is incredibly diverse, and it's incredibly not necessarily polarized, but it has very different viewpoints over what's the right thing or the wrong thing to do. And I think certain things help pull it together and bind it together. One is World Water Week, but one is also that increasingly climate change. And I think it's been happening over the last sort of 5-6 years. I can only see us all accelerating much further to work closer together on understanding how water has such an important role to play for mitigation, and is such a binding force around adaptation because of the shocks and stresses it can put us under. So that does give me hope. And I think a lot of the elements that we are facing is just improving our ability to understand the science, but also improving our ability to both analyze that science, but to articulate it to a much broader community who actually can make change as well as we can. They can drive investment, they can change practices, but we have to get better at articulating that. And I think that's very much happening over the last couple of years. And I think that's only going to accelerate as we hit 2030 as well. Thank you.
And I could add to that two major items. Number one, an increased awareness about the role that water plays for climate change, or in also mitigating and adapting to climate change. I have been part of climate talk since Copenhagen, before Copenhagen even. I've been a negotiator, etc. And we started way back in Cancun, the COP16 it was, I guess. Yes, to start to dig into the climate conference about the water issue. Now we are there with the water pavilion. Pavilion is pavilion, but to get the awareness, I think, among decision makers. But because ultimately it has to be taken decisions from a family, from a business, from a city, and from a state and international. So I think the awareness, that is one part. The second part is what you referred to, Katie. I see a tremendous interest from the young generation, from youth. When we gather World Water Week, we have, well, we count under 35, you're young. Yes, we have 1/3. So thousands of young people now entering into the water sector, and that gives me hope for the future. So thanks a lot for having this conference, and thanks for letting us be sharing our views. Thanks.
Well, thank you all so much. Certainly the work that you've already led and heading into COP is giving all of us a lot of reason to hope. So thank you for being here, Kate, Torgny, and James. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice break and were able to refuel or refresh at least a little bit here. We are going to dive into our next session, the art of the possible. And for this, I'm going to turn it over to Al Cho.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. And welcome back, everyone. So this morning's presenters did a really nice job of opening the aperture for us all. The science presentations talked about how emissions come from urban water infrastructure and from surface water, and that mitigation can happen in both. And then the global policy discussion highlighted the many efforts happening around the world to align funding flows and international commitments to accelerate climate action. And now it's time to turn to some specifics. As I mentioned this morning, several countries have already implemented net zero commitments and are working really hard to get there. And what we've done is to take 3 chunks, each representing a different geography of the agenda. And in each chunk or country case, we've got somebody to talk about the broader context, the regulatory drivers, the kind of political drivers that were shaping the context for action, as well as a utility describing how that translated into action on the ground, what they did or what they are doing to map out a path to net zero. And so we're going to start with the UK. I'll moderate a brief discussion there. Then we'll turn to Denmark, and I'll turn to my friend Art Umbel to lead us through a discussion. And then we'll go to Australia, and my friend Cindy will lead us through a discussion. And so we're going to move through these quickly so that we can get a lot of ideas on the table. Please share your questions for the speakers in the chat, and we'll attempt to cover as many of them as possible. So with that, I want to start with the UK. And I just have to say I've been so impressed by what's been happening in the UK. There's an industry association of water utilities called Water UK, represented here by Sam Larson, that's been working to align all of the water utilities in the UK around a shared vision and roadmap to net zero, which is really quite remarkable if you think about it. And you've got water companies, including Wessex Water, that have just done some really groundbreaking work in mapping out where emissions are coming from and what they're going to do in order to get to net zero. And so I wanted to introduce briefly Sam and Dan. Sam is from Wessex Water. Sorry, Sam is from Water UK, where he is a policy manager that has really led much of the activity around the net zero route maps for Water UK. And then we've also got Dan, who leads many of the sustainability initiatives at Wessex Water. And both of them will be able to share the broader experience. So Sam, why don't I start with you to give the bigger macro picture? I think you have a couple of slides, and then we'll go from there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Al. Let's do that. Let's go through the gears on that scene setting first before we hand over to Dan on detail. So here in the UK, as many people will know, we have a net zero target set in legislation that applies to the UK territory, which effectively means that the UK government has to put in place policies across society to achieve net zero by 2050. Those are enshrined in something called the carbon budgets, and each 5-year period, the government has a target that it has to meet on its journey towards net zero. And here in the UK, there is an organisation called the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, which advises the government about the level of those budgets and how they can best be achieved in each period. And here on the screen is a chart which sort of summarises the trajectory that the UK as a whole, not just the water sector, but the UK as a whole, needs to take to meet that 2050 net zero target. Now, the black line represents the past, the performance to date, and as many will know around the world, a lot of the low-hanging fruit on the emissions trajectories around the world has already been taken. So some of the easier, let's say easier, things that can be achieved by society, maybe some of those things that happen in the background without really the public ever noticing, things like changing where energy is generated, for example. Those low-hanging fruits have already been taken, and around the world, in the UK included, we now start to buy into some of the more difficult parts of that emission trajectory, and government here in the UK now starting to release strategies and policies really aim at driving that next layer of sort of transformation across society down to net zero by 2050. Now, obviously, the intention of that is to drive change transformation at sector level and with the public. So lots of meaty issues to tackle within all of that. Take us on to the next slide, please, if you wouldn't mind, Linda. Thanks. Now, the reason I've given you that scene setting is that it will be really important for all those sectors operating in a region where their governments have a net zero target, that your own work on net zero aligns with that. Now, one of the things we found since releasing our route map nearly 2 years ago was that government, to some extent, compartmentalize their own planning around their net zero target, and they tend to consult in individual little packets or pockets of policy, transport, things like energy policy, biomethane, those sorts of things all come out as discrete little packets. So organizing yourself in the same way as government has proven to be very important for us here in the UK. So as I mentioned, we released a route map, and that's available on the Water UK website on our route map page, and there's lots of videos and documentation there that sets out what we did. But in brief, in 2019, we committed as a sector, as a whole sector, all 18 companies operating in the UK, to release a route map to plot our journey to net zero by 2030. It's our operational emissions down to net zero by 2030. Now, the first thing to say, same as many other speakers have said, is the water industry is very significant in the journey to net zero. And one of the big purposes of the route map was to call out why we are so significant, big consumers of electricity, big enablers for other sectors here in the water sector. Now, in our route map, we analysed over 30 different interventions that we could take as a sector to get the whole sector to net zero. We did a lot of analysis around what they might cost, how fast they could be enabled, what effectiveness they would have in a range of scenarios. And we pulled all that together into the route map. And on the right-hand side is an illustration. It's actually our technology pathway, one of 3 pathways that we put together in the route map. It sets out how we could, as an industry, get to net zero. In this particular example, this particular chart, by leaning heavily on new technologies as a way to reaching net zero. And there's a lot of analysis in the route map that underpins all of that, quite a useful resource of information. So here in the UK, having released our route map, we're starting to see now other sectors take a similar approach and to produce similar route maps, plotting their own course to net zero. So I thought I would end with just giving you some insights from our perspective here in water, having produced a route map, a few insights from looking back at that process to sort of explain the lessons that we learned along the way. So first thought is that delivery requires a lot of detail. Now in the route map, you'll see there are a lot of charts like these. There's a lot of analysis about measures you could take. But actually, looking back at it, ambition doesn't take any detail at all. And actually, we made our commitment knowing what needed to be done. We knew that we had to commit to get to net zero. We knew that was what society required. And we made that commitment with very little underpinning detail about the measures themselves. That came along later. So I think the first insight looking back is that actually making the commitment doesn't require too much detail at all. It requires clear purpose, I would say. The second insight, I would say, looking back, is that at the beginning of producing the route map, we fretted a lot about different business models, different territorial targets, different asset bases, all that sort of stuff. And as it transpired, none of that really mattered. We looked at all of the available measures, because getting to net zero in the sort of time frame requires you to pursue all of the measures, as some of the other speakers have said. So we simply put them all into the route map. We modeled them all side by side, and we found the most effective path overall. So again, similar to the first point, it's no need to fret too much at the outset, because to some extent, the process of creating a route map can kind of overcome all of those small differences. Third reflection would be, in hindsight, it's okay to aim high. And to some extent, we knew that the 2030 target was ambitious. As I said, we didn't have the specific measures all fully mapped out when we made that commitment. But actually, others have joined us along the way. You know, other things have come to light that have helped close the gap between what we knew and what we didn't know. And since creating the route map maybe 2 years ago, companies have effectively recommitted to that path, having found more detail that supports that transition. And then finally, I would just leave you with the thought that actually water companies are really well placed to support governments in the way that Kate Lamb described earlier on. You know, part of the process of sectors creating route maps is about giving governments confidence to act quickly and act fast and make greater commitments for greater action. And we found here in the UK that that's certainly true. And the work that the UK water sector did, to some extent, gave government departments sort of the confidence to be able to make their own actions. So I think, Al, that's probably it in a nutshell, the scene set from the UK perspective.
Fantastic. Sam, I really appreciate it. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions on this. I know I have a couple, but what a wonderful way to launch us into, Dan, your presentation. Dan, I would love to hear how you and the team at Wessex Water have translated that into action.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Al and colleagues, for the invitation to speak to you today. Before I talk about what Wessex Water has done, the company that I work for, I thought I'd just mention some of the work that I'm involved with through another industry association that we have here in the UK Water Industry Research, which is a membership body. And effectively it carries out and commissions single voice research projects that all the water companies would benefit from doing, and where it would make no sense for everyone to do the same bit of research and duplicate effort. UCWI's program is directed by a set of strategic issues, and carbon is one of the dozen of those, where we start with a high level what if statement. What if we could be a carbon positive sector by 2050 is essentially the thing that we're working to. What would it take to do that? And so I'm the program manager for the carbon theme. We've broken it down into some other sections, some sub-themes. So energy and transport, the obvious stuff about decarbonising those. Process emissions, we've heard a bit about methane and nitrous oxide already, and those are going to be really rising up the agenda for water and wastewater utilities. And then looking up and down our value chain, the investment choices that we make and the stuff that we purchase, because we're very conscious that even if you went 100% renewable and you decarbonize your fleet, if you're still pouring concrete in vast quantities, that has a big embodied carbon footprint. And so you've got to be thinking about that. Land use also, and indeed customers, how they use water. So those are the themes that we're working to in the process of identifying what would be the most pertinent research topics over the next few years, because we know there are some big known unknowns in this area. There's, although we've been reporting on our carbon footprint individually as companies and as a sector for, well, in our case, a couple of decades at Wessex Water, there are still some things where the numbers we're reporting on particular aspects are based on some pretty broad estimates and some fairly heroic assumptions, and we're going to need to pin those down. I mentioned whole life carbon. That's exactly one of those things. If you take a set of assets, the carbon is not just about the operational time period for it, but about the concrete, the steel, the aggregates, etc., that have been used to create that physical asset. And if we want to improve an aspect of our service or an impact on the water environment, what might be the lowest carbon ways of doing that when you think through the entire lifetime of the scheme or the thing that you're working on there? Land carbon sequestration, developing a tool at the moment with some sort of very smart biologists and terrestrial ecologists to basically create a resource that any water company could use to look at its land holding and work out what the annual carbon fluxes are, and indeed the best way of managing that land holding to maximize sequestration of carbon. Process emissions monitoring control. So we've got a rough estimate for how much nitrous oxide and methane we emit, but it's likely far too low. We've based it off a previous Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change emission factor, which was set, I think, 15 years or so ago. And then last year it was revised and is much, much, much higher. And we've got some research underway to essentially start properly monitoring wastewater treatment plant to understand exactly how much nitrous oxide and methane is emitted, and then to look at control measures to make sure that we can limit those emissions rather than just letting them go up and down. I'll then go on to the next slide if I can, please. Yes, so at Wessex Water, our carbon footprint, it's about 1/20th of the sector's total footprint. So as a sector, we think we emit about 2 million tons of CO2 every year, CO2 equivalent. So that's looking at all greenhouse gas emissions. And for us, about half of that is from electricity, a quarter is from those process emissions, and then a quarter from other things, transport, energy that we generate on site, standby generators, etc. We've got this kind of stretching goal. We want to get to net zero operational emissions by 2030. However, as I've been hinting at, we think those operational emissions, as in the previous bullet point, are only part of the story. So we need to look at our total emissions. So that's embodied carbon in construction materials that we use each year, and in consumables like treatment chemicals, because that is really the carbon footprint of the sector. And again, as Sam says, you start with a bold goal without knowing how you're going to get there, or even kind of what the quantum is in our case. But it will definitely focus effort, because we know this is the right thing to do. We've got to get on with it. And in terms of the options, there are some readily available things, some of which we've already been doing over several years. So turning biogas from anaerobic digesters into electricity. So you have sewage sludge derived power, and injecting some of that biogas in a purified form into the local gas grid, or using it for vehicles. So ways of decarbonising engine transport from some resource we've got ourselves. We will be looking more at wind and solar, again, looking at low carbon fuels and ways of optimising wastewater treatment to limit nitrous oxide, as mentioned. These are things that are pretty much market ready. They're well established, but they will only get us 3/4 of the way there, probably. So we need to look at some other more innovative options. So things like turning sewage sludge into biochar, a virtually inert material that will be locking up carbon for decades, if not hundreds of years, but a very difficult process sometimes to run and operate. It takes a lot of knowledge and technical chops in order to manage those processes. What's the potential around biohydrogen? There's going to be huge demand for hydrogen. Can we be part of that new emerging hydrogen-based economy? And indeed going to nature-based solutions and making sure that those themselves are, carbon positive, that we're not inadvertently creating constructed wetlands, for example, that turn out to be carbon sources rather than sinks. So lots to go at in the next few years.
Excellent. Well, Dan and Samuel, what a cool overview. And while chat questions come in, I have a couple that have been at the top of my mind, which is, Sam, you talked about 2019 getting started as a sector, even before any regulation. I'd be curious to the two of you, how did that process get started around making that commitment in the absence of a regulatory driver? And then second, how did you think about the costs, the economics of doing this? And what was that conversation like with the finance directors or the CFOs of the different water companies?
Yeah, two very good questions. So I would say, looking back to 2019, I think even then it was fairly clear that something of this nature was coming down the tracks. Some sectors seem to have sort of sat and waited for it to land and have sort of made it a regulator or government-led issue. We in the water sector don't really have a kind of predisposition to that. We've always, I think, true around the world, we've always sort of tended to be on the leading edge of these sorts of things, especially when it comes to the environment. So the sector as a whole decided that the right thing to do would be to come forward with a significant commitment in this space. And actually with that came a number of challenges. I mean, I spoke earlier about not knowing entirely what the measures were, but actually, if you go back to 2019, nobody knew what net zero meant at sector level. There was no definition of net zero at sector level. It was a territorial thing, really, and even not hugely well established at that level. So a number of kind of challenges fell out of that. You know, we had to trailblaze a bit. In terms of the costs, so in the route map, actually, there are some tables which set out some costs for each of the three main pathways that the sector may end up relying on. And obviously, there are ways of financing all of that. You know, the money to run the water industry, some of it comes from customers, some of it comes from taxes, you know, it comes from various different places. Some of it comes from sale of our outgoing goods like biogas and electricity that we generate. So what we did in the route map was we found the most efficient paths to do it. And the engagement that we're having with government at the moment is how do you find the most efficient route to net zero for society as a whole, with water playing its part in things like energy transformation and other sectors of society as they decarbonize, to make sure that the cost for society as a whole is the lowest it can be. And that's the space we're in at the moment.
Yeah, it's apparent that the cost per ton of CO2 abated varies hugely across the range of options you have available. That there are a good number that over a 10-year period are definitely cost beneficial. It's not a net cost, and that's especially in renewable energy, wind and solar dominating there. So that's ceasing to be, I think, an economic argument. It's more one about how you do that in ways which don't annoy our neighbours in harsh terms and blunt terms, particularly where you're operating in areas where you've got protected landscapes and so on, such as in the west of England where I'm based, and where putting up wind turbines everywhere would be met potentially with quite a bit of local opposition. So it's how we go about doing that sensitively, but with enough sense of urgency. At the other end of the spectrum, yes, there are some things that would be hugely costly, and you wouldn't probably recoup in terms of the pounds per ton of CO2. There isn't an obvious commercial driver or anything like that, or a regulatory one to justify the cost. But we know that the agenda is moving fast on this one. Government is getting more and more interested in the full range of options, and starting to ask some fairly what could have been considered, thinking the unthinkable in terms of the scale of investment that might be needed to tackle things like methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions.
Excellent. Real fast, just a question from Heather Cooley at the Pacific Institute. Are you guys looking at water demand as a means of reducing energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, and then energy savings in homes and businesses associated with those reductions?
Yeah, we are, and we do quite a lot on water demand, sort of raising awareness about that for a range of reasons, a range of drivers, not least in the drier parts of the country around pressures on rivers and streams and areas where water abstraction could be posing a problem in terms of river levels and so on. The carbon side of it, I have to say, is a bit less persuasive. Given that most of the energy used for delivering water and sort of cleaning it is electricity, and that's decarbonising at a rapid rate in the UK anyway, because we're changing our whole energy infrastructure nationally. Where it would make a difference would be around hot water use in the home, particularly. So, if we can move to more efficient heating devices, potentially decarbonising the gas supply, through hydrogen and other things, but there are a whole load of issues around that. But it's, behaviourally, if people spent a bit less time in the shower, maybe that would have a good carbon footprint reduction. But it's not a massively popular one to suggest.
Yeah, I'd just add very quickly that there's actually a whole pathway in our route map which focuses on demand reduction, and it looks at all the different sort of elements and aspects of that. One of the areas that seems to be really kind of hot on our minds in the UK at the moment is actually on the industrial side as well. So there is the part around sort of energy use in the home, particularly the gas consumption in the UK to do with heating that water. But also a lot of water in the UK is used industrially as a single pass process. It comes in, it's used once and it goes straight out and away down the drain. Now, if we can get a lot of that industry into sort of 100% reuse, and some companies have shown that this is eminently possible, that saves a whole lot of pumping, treatment, and sourcing what is quite a scarce commodity at some times of the year. So a lot to do in that space.
Thank you so much, Sam and Dan. I know there are other questions, but we're going to move to Denmark now. I just want to congratulate both of you and thank you for the great work in the UK. That route map and all of the kind of company level route maps are among my favorite charts of the last 5 years because they're so inspiring. Really great work. And I want to hand it over to Art to bring us to Denmark and some of the great work that's happening just across the North Sea.
Thanks, Al. And yeah, the Denmark story is an exciting one. And I'm excited to introduce our speakers here momentarily. One of the things I've observed about Denmark is I feel like they've been among the world leaders for the whole last decade in very aggressive planning towards net zero goals. They, in some ways, are very, very ambitious goals. And it gets to Samuel's point a moment ago about setting bold goals. And the whole idea of attacking aggressively the low-hanging fruit, particularly in the energy transition sectors. This has been some of the goals that Denmark has pursued and has made great progress on. I would say, interestingly enough, that despite that great progress, there's still some who would criticize Denmark for still not doing enough. And yet they are, in my opinion, some of the leaders. You know, for example, the reduction of emissions to 70% of their 1990 levels by 2030, it seems to be a very, very aggressive goal. And it's projected now that by 2030, maybe they'll hit 55, 60% in that range, which could be a little bit under what their goal was. But in my view, I feel like they have made incredible real progress, and excited to hear about that story here in a moment. One of the key policy questions is in all of our minds is, with respect to Denmark, how has the role of carbon pricing been played out in the water sector in Denmark in terms of setting these goals and meeting these goals? To that end, then, I'd like to introduce our two speakers to address these topics from Denmark. I'd like to first introduce Morten Lynch. Morten is the General Counsel, Head of Water and Environment Team for the General Consulate of Denmark, and he's based in Houston, Texas. He's previously held similar positions in Canada and in the Middle East, and his primary focus has been on environment, climate, and sustainable development goals, and accelerating that through the Danish innovations of technology and so forth across the globe. Secondly, Ole Fritz Aldeler is the Senior Vice President for Water and Wastewater at HOFOR, which is the Greater Copenhagen Utility in Denmark. And he's responsible for planning and design and operations for all the major technical plants, specializing in pump stations, waterworks, treatment plants, incineration plants, biogas plants, and other things as well. And so I'm going to first turn it over to Morten, and we'll get started with the conversation. Morten, I think you're still on mute.
Yes, sorry. Can you hear me now? Yes, and you're able to see my slides? Perfect. Thank you so much, Art. And thank you for inviting me, Denmark, here today to say a little bit about the you here in the US. Before jumping into what I'm supposed to talk about, goals and drivers, I want to, I just want to give you a little bit of context about Denmark and water. So most of you probably know Denmark, but small nation, 5.8 million people. We are a big water nation. Water has always played a very big role in the Danish societies. And back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we saw a lot of pollution from industrialization and farming. And there was some very tough regulation coming up in the 80s and 90s that actually succeeded in cleaning up all our waterways. And today, for instance, waters around Denmark and in downtown Copenhagen is so clean that you can swim downtown Copenhagen. And I think it also helped putting the sustainability and water on the agenda and on the mindset of Danes. We want to have clean, good water. So today, water is mostly it's the utility, the municipalities in Denmark who's responsible for wastewater treatment and drinking supply. But all the utilities are operated as private companies. So they are at arm's length from the political system. Water prices are not regulated. There is a cap that is calculated, but utilities can set the prices as they want within that cap. But more importantly, all the utilities, they have since, I think, 2011, been under a requirement to increase efficiency by 2% every year. So it means that all our utilities, a lot of people think that because we're doing so well in the water sector, it's because the utilities they have so much money, but it's not the case. The case is they are under severe budget constraints, and the way they have decided to solve this is not by cutting costs, but by innovation and focusing on what is possible. So everything they do in the utilities is still focusing on, return of investment, what's smart in an economic sense. So some of the stuff that we have been looking at in Denmark is, of course, a lot of proactive leak detection, digitalization, resource recovery, real-time monitoring, energy optimization, and energy production. And we have been quite successful in doing that. If you see in the EU, I think 4% of all power is used, or electricity is used for, energy consumption is used for driving the water sector. In Denmark, we are down to 1.7% now. If you look at our emission of phosphorus and nitrogen, it's down below half of the EU requirement. And 80% of our phosphates are now reused as fertilizers. And the entire water sector is almost 70% self-sufficient when it comes to energy. Wastewater sector is close to 90%. So things are really good, really moving in this respect in Denmark. And I think one of the things that's extremely important to notice here is that it's the sector itself that has been the motor, has been the engine. So it's back in 2017, for instance, the sector itself proposed a benchmarking between all the utilities with when it comes to energy efficiency and energy production. And this benchmarking has led a lot of people believe that this benchmarking is what's really moving our sector forward. And we are extremely fortunate to have this very progressive sector. And they are working, another aspect is that they're working very closely with the private sector in partnerships. So the utilities are opening the doors, inviting in companies and developing new solutions. And this focus on optimizing and getting the best out of our resources has also meant that a lot of our utilities are changing their names and visions from having anything to do with wastewater to more focus on we are resource recovery facility instead of wastewater facility. One of the latest things that we have done is that in 2020, again, the sector itself suggested that they should be energy and climate neutral by 2030. The government said, yes, please do that. And then they wrote this into the national climate strategy. And so now, and the Ministry of Environment, they developed a guideline for how to calculate your emissions. And it's set up as a Paris model. So all the utilities on a voluntary basis are informing, they're calculating and reporting on their emissions, but almost all utilities are part of this today. And overall, things are going extremely well. So you see, now we believe we are actually looking into being climate neutral before 2025. So in 3 years, we should be climate neutral in Denmark. And as I said, regulation, it plays a role, but again, it is the utilities who is driving this process. They are focusing that, it's a mindset saying the wastewater is there's no such things as wastewater, it's only displaced resources. When it comes to energy production, we have also come a long way. We have a lot of our utilities, some of our biggest utilities today, they're producing a lot more energy than they're consuming, some 150, 200%. But we still have a way to come to reach 100% energy neutrality for the entire water sector, but there's still a hope and a feeling that we will reach that before 2030. I know right now our government is looking into economic regulation on how they can help incentivize the utilities to become more resource efficient. One more slide, just to say, I noticed, you talked about demand reduction from water supply in the US. In Denmark, that has also been a big focus. So we have actually reduced our water consumption per capita by 40% over the last 30 years, though. But this is despite, strong economic growth and an increasing population. So of course, this has saved us a lot of energy in water transport and a lot of emission on that account. Another thing I want to mention is digitalization. That has really become a big thing right now. The saying is you can't manage what you can't see. So today, digitalization is becoming the heart and the pulse of our utilities. And one reason is also that we can see that when you look at energy savings, emissions, that up to 70% of your savings, they don't come from changing to a more efficient pumps, but it comes by knowing your production, your processes, having real-time sensors and be able to control everything that goes on. So this is a very important step if you want to reach your goals of energy neutrality and emission neutrality. Finally, I just want to say, this is a small commercial. There's the World Congress in 2022 in Copenhagen. So I hope a lot of you will come join us. I also want to say that we have a big water team here in the US. We organize a lot of delegations to Denmark to see what's going on, visit our utilities to get inspired. And I hope that's what we can do, help you get inspired. And I would love to extend an invitation to your imagination team and everyone else on the call, contact us and see what we can do. Hopefully we can work together on making a better water sector in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Morten. Really appreciate that input. And now I'd like to turn it over to Ole.
Thank you. As Morten said, Denmark is a small country, but we are quite big in mind and in results. So now I'll try to go a little bit more into details on how Greater Copenhagen Utility has worked over the last many years. Just to give you an idea of the utility company, we are a multi-utility. We have power plants, district heating, district cooling, town gas, water, and wastewater. We cover around 20% of the Danish population. So in Danish scales, we are quite big, but in the world scale, we are probably not so big, just in mind and results. Could you push for the next slide? I think one of the most important things I can recommend you to do is to get a clear vision of where you want to go and make sure you have a very strong political background. Because without the local political system or the central political system, then you will not move at all. Click twice, please. And one more. Yes, if you can see here, yes, that's fine. Copenhagen municipality, they did a climate plan a few years ago where they stated that Copenhagen has to be CO2 neutral in 2025. And as a utility company, we have to adapt that strategy plan and build it into our strategy plan. And as you can see on the right on this on the slide, we have a vision in our utility company saying that we would like to create a sustainable city. And we are working in 5 years strategy plans. And in 2015, we did a strategy goal saying that in 2025, we would like to be CO2 neutral in all our utility areas in the operation part. And we have been working with that quite a long time, and I will give you the results in a little while. And in our new strategy plan, just accepted by the board in 2020, we did even a more ambitious goal. We said that we would like to be CO2 neutral in 25 years in the whole value chain of everything that we do. And for making that step, we need the rest of the world because we cannot do it alone. Could you give me the next slide? And please click a few times. 1, 2, 3. Yes. Today, we have our operation of all our 7 utility areas 80% CO2 neutral. 80% of our operations are CO2 neutral. That's quite good. If we look at the water supply and the wastewater transport and treatment alone, from 2010 to 2020, we have seen a huge reduction. And we are getting very close to the 0 point of CO2 emissions. And some of the activities, as Morten also showed, some of them are quite basic and has a really good business case. We are implementing energy saving pumps. We are introducing intelligent maintenance, where we have energy consumption curves saying, okay, when are the energy increasing and when do I have to do the maintenance? Because many utility companies are doing it a few weeks, a few months between, and then they are just going out and may do the maintenance, but do it when it's really necessary. Then we are introducing solar cells, a lot of advanced control systems as a digitalization, where we control the system and when to pump at the times where the energy is more green or cheaper. And one of the biggest transitions are on the biogas production. As Morten also said, if you look at the wastewater treatment plants in Copenhagen, they have an energy balance of plus 200%. I don't think you can see that anywhere else in the world. 200% energy balance. So we produce double up that what we use. That is quite unique. One of the ways that we have done that is that we have focused on energy savings, bottom aeration instead of surface aeration, for example, the energy saving pumps. But we have done a lot of effort on pushing our digesters, thermal hydrolyzers to increase the efficiency of the biogas production. And we use the biogas production to produce electricity, to put some heat into our district heating system, and producing biogas to our town gas suppliers also. Then we have worked a lot with the pressure optimization on our water supply system, because if you lower the pressure, you lower the energy consumption. And one of the last areas is that we have put a lot of effort into protection of our groundwater resources by afforestations, and they also have a very positive impact on the CO2 footprint. On some of our other utility areas, for example, on our power plants, we have done a transition to biomass. On district heating, we have changed from steam to hot water. District cooling are using groundwater as a cooling media. The town gas is supplied by the digester, so it's 100% green. And of course, we have looked into raising windmills to produce even more green electricity. And of course, looked on the green transportation. So the journey until now has been focusing, has been a lot focused on operation, and we are quite far in that journey. Could you push for the next slide? And please push, yes, and one more, thanks. Yes, if you look at our new strategy plan, where we are stating that we would like in 25 years, approximately to be CO2 neutral in our whole value chain, then we just stop and look how far are we on the operation side. we will by far reach zero in water and wastewater in 2025. No doubt about that. On some of our other utility areas, district heating, power plants, we are not quite there yet, but we are about 80%. And the last 20%, there will be the difficult part and the more expensive parts, because we need new technologies. We need heating pumps in a bigger scale than we have today. We need intelligent heat storage so that we can save the heat and use it on other times. So we need to be more innovative and get the new technologies up to a beat where we can use them to reach the 100%. And our new goal is a huge challenge. And what we are starting to do is to say, okay, can we build a CO2 reduction goal into our tenders? How do we do with all the materials, the infrastructure that we put down to the ground with concrete and steel? How can we make sure that we do a transition in our whole industry so that we can say in 25 years maybe that some of those materials are actually CO2 neutral? Or can we find other materials that we can use instead? The energy consumption part, because in our nature, we will pump a lot of energy, or we will pump water and use energy. But I'm not so many thoughts about that, because over the next 10, 15 years, the energy will be green. So that will not be a problem. So to summarize where we are in Copenhagen, I think we are quite far in our mindset and our journey. But if we want really to make a big impact, then we have to change our way in the whole value chain of looking at things. And in that journey, we are just starting. And we need cooperation, we need innovation, and we need to get together as a total industry to make this work on the long part. Because operation part, net zero there, we're just starting the journey there. If we want to make the big impact, let's go a step further. And I think we need to do it now. We need to start our mindsets, our innovation today, because it will take a long time to reach that goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ole and Morten. Wow, this is very inspirational and really appreciate this input. We have just a couple minutes here to address a couple questions, and to get it started, I would ask the following question. I'm very interested in understanding a little bit from you how your focus around these technical issues has been communicated to your public so that they are promoted to be motivated for what you as a utility are doing in the water sector, if you know what I mean. In other words, what are you doing on that public outreach side, which is obviously having tremendous benefit for you on the inside of your fence?
I can say one of the things that we have been working with is when we want to create a sustainable city, we cannot do it alone. We need to have our customers joining in on the joint force. So what we have done, as Morten said, we have done a lot of campaigns saying, okay, save the water. And probably we have one of the lowest water consumptions in the whole world when you look at cities as Copenhagen. At the same time, on some of the other utility areas, we have been working with the customer saying, okay, can you hold on to your own rainwater instead of putting it into the central systems? Then we need to pump it less. We need to use less concrete to make the pipes bigger. So we are working a lot on saying, okay, what can you do on your own, inside your own four walls, so that you can help the utility reaching the goals and the city reaching their final goal of the whole Copenhagen area. On the district heating, one of the biggest issues there is that some of the systems are very inefficient. So if you can work with the local VVSers doing the control of the systems in big housings, making sure that the return temperature is in the right scale, then you will have a huge savings there. So we are moving from the public areas to the more private areas and saying, okay, how can you help us do this in a better way and at the same time save some money? And I think that's the most important thing, because we are not fools. If we want to succeed here, we have to make a good business case for the utility, but we also have to make sure that the private households can see that this makes sense in a sustainable way, but it has also to make sense in the economic way.
Great comment. Martin, any response?
No, I think I just want to add, seen from a like U.S. Water Alliance perspective, I think one of the things that the sector in Denmark has been good at is organizing itself. You know, there's a very strong partnership between, you know, the private sector, the utilities, the DANVA with the U.S. Water Alliance, and there's a lot of political discussion. So every time we see our prime ministers talk about environment, she's also talking about water. And it means that also a lot of the young people who's, you know, has an aspiration to do good for the world, you know, they lean toward the water sector. And at the same time, all this focus on digitalization is opening a whole new avenue for engineers and so on. So I think there's been a lot of, you know, where the water sector might have been old-fashioned boots out moving things. Now it's becoming trendy. We like to say it's becoming more sexy in Denmark. And I think that's also why it's so innovative and so much is going on in Denmark. So it's been a long journey, but, you know, people getting together and send the message.
But look, just look at on the three of us, sexy guys, nice hair, good age. So who can blame them?
Well, thank you so much to both of you. These are just really inspirational comments. You know, we're all delighted. I would point everybody's attention to the chat. There's been some really good comments here regarding the social implications of the kinds of conversation that you're having. And I think these are very, very important comments. Obviously, we don't have time to get into those now, but to take note of those. I'd like now to turn it over to my colleague, Cindy Wallace-Lage, to talk about the Australia story.
Awesome. Thank you. Great comments. And definitely three sexy guys there. So I am so excited to have a conversation about Australia and build on what we've been hearing today. And I'm thrilled to have a good friend from a long time, Christabel Ferguson, with us. She's the Chief Innovation Officer for the Water Research Foundation now, but she has been actively engaged in the water sector in Australia for many, many years. And I am thrilled to have you join us and give us some additional perspectives, because I think Australia has a little bit of a different story here in a variety of approaches, range of targets. So can you talk a little bit about what some of the history, the drivers have been for that? And do you see how they may be able to unify the sector?
Well, thanks, Cindy. And it's a real pleasure to be here today as the resident Australian in America. So great to be able to highlight some of the achievements from my home country. And I think I'd like to start by really highlighting, I think the first significant thing that really happened in Australia was 2011, when Julia Gillard's Labor government actually introduced a carbon tax. So that Carbon Clean Energy Act, which was implemented in 2012, resulted in companies that were affected by that act dropping their energy consumption and emission rates by 7% when it was introduced. The unfortunate thing was that the opposition government very clearly opposed that tax and immediately said that they would repeal it if the government was to change, which subsequently happened. So unfortunately, the legislation was only in place for a short period of time, and it didn't have the full effect that it potentially could have. However, it was a real wake-up call for the water sector, and it really spurred a lot of discussion and a lot of interest in how can we better prepare ourselves as a sector for what was coming down the pipeline, and was obviously, you know, climate change was starting to really have an impact in Australia. So I'm going to outline now a couple of the what, hows, and whys of what has been going on in Australia. And one of the things, the what that's been happening has been the setting of targets. And a couple of our previous speakers have highlighted the importance of having a clear vision. And there are some utilities and many in the water sector who've really put a stake in the sand and said, we are going to meet these targets. First and foremost, the state of Victoria, where 19 water corporations have come together and committed to reducing emissions by 42% by 2025. They also committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2050, but many of them recognised that that was not an ambitious enough target, and the 4 largest utilities in Victoria have committed to reaching carbon neutral by 2030. So this has really set the scene, and Victoria is really leading the way in terms of how Australia is responding to carbon. And some of the utilities have put in place some pretty ambitious targets. So, but as a state, they've come together and really said, this is the direction we're going, and how they're going to achieve it. As some of our previous speakers have highlighted, there are existing technologies that are ready to be implemented. And so, for example, Southeast Water has already installed solar panels at 2 of their water recycling plants. They're installing cogeneration at another plant, and they're looking at alternate sources of electricity. So 12 of the companies in Victoria actually banded together to buy renewable energy from the electricity grid from one of the biggest solar energy suppliers in Victoria. So the sector is really working together. The companies are really working together in a concerted way to see how they can actually reduce emissions overall. Because in Victoria, a quarter of the Victorian government's emission targets, actually the emissions are all coming from the water sector. So it is one of the most important sectors. It's also being complemented by research. So there is just a new project that was only announced two weeks ago, where Southeast Water is actually partnering with Monash University and Water Research Australia, and they're looking at how to produce hydrogen peroxide and using solar energy to do that. So the research is a really strong focus, but using traditional technology is definitely also on the cards. So for example, in Western Australia, they're using biogas right now to produce 20% of the energy for Woodman Point's plant, but they're also looking to increase that. And at their Beenya plant, they're also going to be looking to produce at least 70% of the plant's electricity needs very, very soon. So there are a number of initiatives that the government is actually, particularly the Victorian government, has signed on to and has a commitment. So the important thing there was the Victorian political commitment to actually reaching carbon neutral and the importance of net zero, and then the water utility sector coming together to collaborate to actually set those targets. Some of the other states are also setting targets, but they're a little bit less ambitious. So South East Queensland Water has set a target for net carbon zero by 2050. Sydney Water as well has set a carbon target of net zero by 2050. But each of those organisations is also looking at having energy plans that they're implementing. So the different approaches, though, that have been taken, Melbourne Water I want to highlight in particular because they have been practicing integrated water cycle management, which is what we call sort of that whole bringing together of the circular economy of water. That is a really fundamental process that has been embedded in the Australian water sector for quite some time. Melbourne Water have used that, and in their planning, they sort of came together and said, well, you know, how can we use this to actually help us get to net zero carbon as well? So I'd like to just show some of how they're doing it now. And if I could ask Linda to maybe tee up, there's a video which summarises some of the initiatives that Melbourne Water is putting in place.
At Melbourne Water, it's our job to ensure we have a secure water supply, a reliable sewage system and drainage network, and healthy rivers and creeks. These services help make Melbourne a great place to live. But climate change presents challenges to the world as we know it, including our water services. Getting water to your home and taking away and treating your sewage uses a lot of energy. And that's why we're taking action on climate change. We pledge to halve our carbon emissions by 2025. We're also on a path to reduce them to net zero by 2030. Net zero doesn't mean we won't be producing any carbon emissions. It means we will remove as much greenhouse gas from the atmosphere as we produce. We've long adapted our operations to prepare for a changing climate. We've already reduced our impact through lowering our emissions, using sewage byproducts such as biogas and biosolids as a resource, and generating more renewable energy. But there's more to be done. We'll continue to reduce our emissions as much as we can using available technologies. That includes working with our partners, scientists, and the water sector to develop new ways to reduce our carbon footprint. To make up for emissions that can't be reduced, we'll invest in carbon offsets. Melbourne Water is taking action on climate change to enhance the life and livability of our great city, now and into the future. And that's why we're on a path to reduce our emissions to net zero by 2030. To find out more, visit our website.
Thanks, Linda. And so I think the final thing that I'd like to kind of add, Cindy, to this is the fact that we recognise we can't do it alone. And I particularly love your comment that we either all win or we all lose. And we see this as a really important collaborative effort that the water sector can really make a significant contribution across the globe. And so, for example, some of the projects that Melbourne Water is doing, they had an innovation contest. And they actually had Cranfield University working with RMIT in Victoria to come up with a new low emission wastewater treatment train. And so they're testing that at laboratory scale and looking at how that can be actually scaled up. As well as that, there are projects that have been done on directly measuring Scope 1 emissions to really address the fact that there are major data gaps in terms of our estimates of emissions across the whole delivery chain, including the distribution networks, and making sure that we're capturing fugitive emissions that might not have been included in current calculations. So those are a lot of the things that we are doing in Australia. And the last thing I kind of want to add is just why are we doing it? And I think that's a question that does come up. People say, well, why is the water sector taking this lead? And it's because there's a real belief in the water sector that we can make a significant contribution and we can lead the way. We don't want to be the lagging sector in this space. We want to demonstrate what's really possible. And we have a commitment and the support of our communities to be doing that. So these programs that have been set up in both Melbourne Water and Sydney Water are programs that really involve engagement with the communities and really talk to and engage with the communities about what it is that they want and what their expectations are. So I'll just leave it there, I think.
Excellent. Really appreciate the comments. Great video. And it's interesting to see all the different approaches. And I was curious, you talk about political will, and which is always an absolute critical piece. If we don't have that, we can't keep moving. Can you talk at all also about regulatory? So being able to enable, because sometimes the technologies that we want to use as we come up with new ideas and we see that it has opportunity, our barrier becomes regulatory adoption and acceptance. How do you see the regulations? Have they been helping, hurting? How do you see that change?
Well, that's a really good question, because I think there's a really significant difference between the American environment and the Australian environment. So the Australian regulatory environment, it's a much more, I wouldn't say open, but there's a lot more dialogue between what the regulators expect to see happen. There's a lot of direction setting. There's a lot of discussion around what the targets are and what the direction is that they want us to take. And there are frameworks that they use to set requirements, but it's not a punitive system in Australia. So there is a really good relationship between the water sector and the legislators and the regulators, and it's a real collaborative space. We see it as a failure. If you get fined in Australia, that's a real failure. It doesn't happen all that often because the utilities are very, very proactive and the regulators are really clear about the direction that they want to set. So there's a lot of signals that are sent about, well, this is what we want you to achieve. And there's a lot of collaboration and there's a lot of space for innovation to actually help us achieve those targets. So we tend to set very outcomes-based regulations. So it's not how you get there, it's here's the target we'd like you to get to, figure out how you're going to get there. And I think that is really important in allowing and enabling all of these very innovative approaches to be tried. And I think a few of our previous speakers have really highlighted the fact that, throwing all the solutions on the table, don't worry about which ones are actually the right one. They're all potentially great. So let's try them all. Let's see what works and go with that. And not, if we sit here trying to work out what's the most optimum solution, we're going to be wasting time. We need to actually just start trying things and just, learn as we go and learn from each other. And that's, again, where I think the collaboration and events like this are really critically important to help share the knowledge base, share the case studies, see what's working, see what might be most appropriate for your given situation.
I'm just going to ask for clarity because it does have challenges within the US. Is the regulatory focus, is that a national focus and coordination, or is that state by state? Because we have a real challenge with state by state and everybody taking a different approach.
Yeah, sure. It's exactly the same system in some ways as here in the States. So the federal government will set a national target. And so, for example, the Gillard government introduced national legislation that then would be flowed down to the states. So similar to here, the federal government would set like a baseline of this is what needs to be achieved. And then they would say to each state, you implement this in whatever way you see fit, but this is what you've got to meet. And just like here, some states will go above and beyond that, and others will go, okay, we'll just meet the minimum requirement. So it is a similar system. The tragedy for us is that the head start we got on that carbon tax that was implemented in 2011 was repealed. And the minute that the Liberal government repealed that tax, the emissions went back to what it was previously. So we missed the boat there in terms of an opportunity to really get ourselves much further ahead in our targets as to what we wanted to achieve. So it was, in my view, a really unfortunate setback, but it was a very timely wake-up call because it started everybody's processes thinking, how do we need to get there? What do we need to do? What are the targets that we should be thinking about? And so the water sector kind of took that warning and ran with it and has continued to really innovate and to try to actually work out what needs to be done proactively. So we know most likely there'll be a change of government very shortly, and then a federal regulation change, I think, will be imminent in Australia, and that will then again flow down to state requirements. The Victorian government has really shown leadership by putting in place a water plan for Victoria in 2016, which set that target of carbon neutral by no later than 2050. And that spurred and gave the impetus to the Victorian water sector to then go, okay, we can probably do better than that. Let's get together and work out what can we do. So.
I think it's so impressive that the leadership that the water sector has taken, and I think it goes back to some of the comments that Kate made earlier today, is that we have every opportunity to truly be the leaders because of the role that we play in every community, and we can step up and have so much influence. A question that came in, and I think you pretty much answered it, but just getting back to with the regulators, do you think that there's enough education of the regulators on the carbon reduction that they can be really helpful in helping develop that? Or is that an area that we still need more education? Because sometimes there can be that they're listening, but they don't have the background or the engagement maybe to be able to help us push forward as much as just come along for the ride.
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And I think one of the previous speakers also mentioned the importance of the water sector being articulate about what it is that we're trying to achieve, what it is we're able to contribute, and what the importance of that can be to support governments in making this transition and making these changes. I don't think that the community or the regulators, I don't want to single out the regulators themselves. I think all of us are learning this language, and the document that Al referred to that the US Water Alliance has put together, just making sure that we're all talking the same terminology. It is a complex area. There are many technical innovations that can contribute, and it's hard to get your head around how they might all fit together. So I think we're all learning this language, and we're all learning and increasing our understanding about what we need to do. So the language and the education and the communication with communities, with stakeholders, with legislators, with regulators, it's increasingly important that the water sector is able to communicate in this space effectively. And by doing so, I think we definitely will continue to lead the way.
I think that's a really important point that you talked about, the conversation and the education, the communication, all of those with all of our stakeholders, and understanding that we are all shareholders in the answer, right? So
that's right.
We are all going, as you said, we're either all going to be successful or none of us will be successful. And so it's having the ability to have that communication. I think that's an area, the U.S. Water Alliance, I was just thinking, we've done a great job with Imagine a Day Without Water to really elevate the importance of water in our communities and why we have to invest. But, maybe we need to talk having that Imagine a Day that goes along with climate change. Imagine a day in 2050. I've seen some of those vignettes that have been put forward, and they're very stark, right? But I think a lot of us day to day, we're moving on. We're not seeing the impact. I think Al made that comment earlier. It's the future is here, but it's not affecting us all the same. And how do we get enough education? Because we have to have all of the shareholders involved, or we have to talk at a level that everyone can understand they have a role.
I couldn't agree more, Cindy. And I don't want to really imagine a day in 2050, because I think it's going to be really hot. I think the water resources are going to be really scarce. The water might be saline. There will be some areas that are flooded. There will be some areas that are in drought, an extreme drought. And Australia and this year California and areas in Turkey and Canada are all seeing the dramatic impacts of wildfires and extreme drought. And so climate change is happening right now. I agree with Liz Garfield. We can't wait 20 years to start helping our planet. We actually have to start acting right now. So it's great to be part of the water sector. I think the water sector is really leading the way. It's very inspiring to see what's happening in the UK and in Denmark in particular, and Australia, trying to also contribute to this in the world scheme. And I think collaboration between all of us is really going to be important if we're all to succeed. So thank you for letting me sharing some of the stories from Australia.
Well, thank you for sharing the stories from Australia. It's been great to hear about the differences and also the leadership that is stepping up, which is fantastic, right? Because I think the beauty of the water community is we're not a competitive community as far as I'm trying to beat you out commercially, right? We all have a very different sector, and that allows us to collaborate beyond what anybody else can do. So, okay, well, thank you so much for your time. It's great seeing you. I look forward to seeing you in person sometime. And I'm going to turn this back over to Al, I believe.
Thanks, Cindy.
Outstanding. Thanks, Christabel and Cindy, two powerful and brilliant leaders in our sector. Look, I know we are short on time, and I just want to do a quick lightning round with a question. Eric, we're going to take your question up tomorrow. It's a great question in the chat, but I wanted to ask each of the presenters to hold yourself to 15 to 20 second lightning round answer. So the question is, take yourself back a few years. You're already 80%, wherever to your net zero commitment. If you're just getting started now, what advice would you give to either yourself a couple of years ago or to utilities that are just starting that journey, since about 50% of the utilities and organizations on this call have not yet made a net zero commitment or a greenhouse gas reduction commitment of any kind. So whether Dan or Samuel or Ola or Christabel or Morten are still on, please jump in and give us your lightning round answer.
I don't mind jumping in there if that's all right, Al. I would say go for it. I kind of wish, when I look back, that we'd gone for it a little earlier. We hesitated a little. It didn't take months, but we really thought it through before we went for it. I would say we didn't need to agonize over it quite so much. So I think my top tip would be go for it.
Fantastic.
Along similar lines, once you've decided that, sort of get measuring and reporting, and if you're reporting a number that you're not 100% sure about, be honest about that, but just report it anyway. Say this is the the number that we can best estimate with our available knowledge, and come and help us refine that. And it draws people in as well, the kind of solution providers within your organization, the people who've got that kind of ingenuity and that creative spark and want to try and work out a way to bring that number down.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I think just for me to add, I think it will be important to anchor this at the top of the organization, make a clear vision around it, and make that trickle down the organization, because I think what we can see also in Denmark are some of the utilities are still conservative. And so they need someone to be the light, show the path and say, this is something we want to do. And then get the whole organization involved and create a training, learning facilities around this. Let everyone in the organization come up with ideas on what they can do in their small little niche of their organization.
I was just going to add, don't be afraid to ask the crazy questions, like reach out and ask other people what they're doing and collaborate, and be prepared to work with others and share the knowledge and the learnings that you have. Because I think that's going to accelerate the rate at which we can really progress in this space.
And Ola? We may have lost Ola. It's almost
Ola left office. It was quite late. He's been there all day.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, with that, look, we've gotten some great examples from around the world. I just want to thank all of our international participants. It really, you have nothing to, draws you necessarily to the U.S. water sector other than your goodwill and the fact that, as Cindy said, we all win together, we all lose together. And we really appreciate your sharing your insights so we can all win together. And with that, I want to pass it back to Cindy for some closing remarks. Thanks again to all of our presenters.
Great, thanks, Al. And yeah, what a fantastic time. It went so fast. I can't believe it's already time to close. So I thought about how do you close a session like this, because there's such great information and everybody has such powerful stories and statements. And so I decided that I was going to come up with an acronym to help us. And so the theme for today I took away is action. And we started out having that conversation with Josh Weinberg saying, it's climate action, that's mitigation and adaptation. And Al mentioned the more we do with mitigation, the less adaptation we need. And so we need to be progressive along those lines. So I'm going to use action as our word and also as our acronym. So this was tough and some of them I had to cheat. I have two for some of the letters because I couldn't come up with just one. I couldn't decide just one. And so the first one is A, and that is starting with Al's comment earlier, which I loved, which was the focus on and. It's very easy for us to come up with the reasons why we can't. Oh, this is all great, but, and I think we had several great examples. And he said we had to get to the and. We're doing well, and we can do more. And so how we bring in the and into our dialogue will be important. But also important to me was that the conversation that has been there about aim high. It's very easy for us to say there's a limitation or it's going to be too hard or I'm not sure how we're going to get there. And so we set a lower expectation or lower bar because we think, well, we want to make sure that we can get there. But that doesn't really drive us to think differently. So we need to aim high. And the stories were great to hear from around the world how people have set a clear vision to allow themselves to aim high. So for C, I had two again, which was collaboration and commitment. And the collaboration, I think the stories from the UK, from Australia, from Denmark, from many, many locations show how it takes the sector working together to collaborate. And there was I think it was James Dalton, if I have the name right. There was it takes a broad network of actors, which I loved, for us to be able to make this work. It gets back to the stakeholders and the shareholders. And we need to be able to share those lessons learned. We need to share our successes. This is not a competition. This is a collaboration, and we have to work together to find that solution that's going to accelerate our path forward and be able to do something sooner than later. And that means we have to be committed. and the political will. It's engaging with our communities, making sure the regulatory agencies are involved. You know, they help us with the commitment that we're going to do this, that we can do this, that this is our job, and it's making big commitments, taking bold steps, and acting with urgency, as Kate Lamb noted. So T is transformation and technology. And I think that the comments we've had today, there's been a lot of transformation in our sector. We have been transforming, and sometimes when we're in the midst of it, we don't always see what we've achieved. We've achieved a lot. We just have a lot more to go. And we can't be afraid of transforming. We have to make sure that we are willing to push ourselves forward, that we're willing to innovate. And that innovate means looking at technology. There's a lot of technology that's there that we could use now and we need to implement. And we have different barriers that we sometimes let get in our way. How do we overcome that? But that technology makes a big difference for us to make sure that we can achieve our goals. And the conversation about technology, just to be able to have water and wastewater services for every individual around the globe, huge impact. We have technologies to make this work. We've got to get it done. For I had integral and influence. And that is our sector. We are integral to the solution. We are integral to allowing ourselves to achieve the climate actions that are needed in order to have the greenhouse gas reductions that are needed. And I think the conversations today, when we talked about a lot of data that showed the water and wastewater influence and what we have in carbon, but then you looked at even broader for the non-treated and what could be there. But then you really even round out the overall opportunity for us to make a difference, because water, I think, as Kate said, it's the lifeblood of community. It's foundational to health, to environment, to economic development. And we can be the influencers. We can be the leaders. We are the connective link that brings the communities together. We can influence policy, we can influence government, we can influence the way our shareholders all operate. And that is at the resident level, at a business level, at a government level, all of us, we have that ability to be that influencer. For O, I love the focus earlier about opportunities and optimism. We can get a little caught up in the gloom and doom of this. As we talked about earlier, I don't know that I want to imagine the day in 2050. I want to imagine the day in 2050 with optimism and understanding that the opportunity that's there. As we mentioned earlier, we have a lot of the technology, the knowledge. It's all here for us. It's how we bring it together and we have it form our solutions. And Christabel, I loved your comment of don't wait and try and find the perfect solution. Start moving. And we have to start moving. We have a lot of those solutions in place. What we have to find is the commitments to a unified purpose, to change our mindset, to eliminate the barriers and to drive that change. And I am very optimistic that we can do that, because as a sector, we have always looked at the opportunities to do more. And that's what makes a difference for us to be successful. And the N, I'm sure you guessed it. And this one, I only have one word for it, and it is now. The future is here, as Al said earlier. It just isn't evenly distributed. And we have to act now. We cannot be thinking about 2050. We have to be thinking about today, because every day that we don't act is a lost opportunity to make change and to protect our future. The time for business as usual is over. And I am so appreciative of so many of the stories today that showed how many utilities around the globe have said business as usual is over, and they have taken aggressive steps, aggressive actions to make a change. And they've done it, and the rest of us, now is our time, and we need to act. So I hope you really enjoyed today. I loved it. I loved the stories, and I look forward to additional conversations with many of you tomorrow. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Katie.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Cindy. You just left this in a perfect place, so I'm not even going to try to touch that, but thank you for being here. And Linda, if you could put up our last slide for us here. As we hit the top of the hour, I just want to give an enormous thank you to all of these folks on the screen and everyone behind the scenes who helped make this symposium happen today. I hope you all learned a lot. I hope you'll all continue to share insights with us as the Imagination team charges forward here in the United States. We all win or we all lose together. So please reach out with further questions, further resources, insights that you want to share with us. And all of the speakers' contact information is up on the screen. Thank you all so much, and we will see you soon. Have a great day.